A metal food tray hit the concrete wall at the end of the fourth-floor corridor, and the sound wasn't a bang so much as an explosion. A flat, percussive crack that traveled through the walls and brought every conversation on the unit to a stop in the same instant. The tray split when it landed. One half skidded under the supply cart outside room 412. The other came to rest in the middle of the hallway, and for about 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the hallway cleared. It didn't empty gradually. It emptied the way a room empties when everyone in it has made the same instantaneous calculation and arrived at the same answer. A nursing assistant who'd been restocking the linen cart pushed the cart to the side and back toward the stairwell door. 2 orderlies who'd been transporting a patient in a wheelchair turned the chair around and moved fast in the opposite direction. The charge nurse, a woman named Deborah Osei, who had been working psychiatric units for 16 years, and who was not, by any reasonable measure, someone who scared easily, picked up the phone at the nursing station with the deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed this scenario enough times that the adrenaline no longer interfered with the procedure. She called security. She called administration. She did not call the attending physician because the attending physician was already aware of room 412 and had already requested twice in 9 days that the nursing assignment be changed. 2 security officers appeared from the elevator. They positioned themselves outside the door and did not go in. The corridor smelled like industrial cleaner, and the specific anxious stillness of a space where people were waiting to find out how bad something was going to get. Then a nurse appeared from the direction of the nursing station, walking at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, with a pen tucked behind one ear and a chart folder under her left arm and ink on the inside of her left wrist where she'd written a medication note and hadn't had time to transfer it properly. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that had probably been neater 6 hours ago. She was not large. She was not visibly armed with anything. She had no radio, no escort, and no expression on her face that suggested she was doing anything other than going where she was going. She stopped outside room 412. She looked at the security officers. She looked at the half of the tray in the middle of the hallway. She looked at the door. Then she knocked twice, said clearly, "Mr. Reed, it's Larkin Mercer. I'm going to open the door slowly," and opened it. The 2 security officers exchanged a look. Inside the room, a 90-pound military working dog named Atlas had repositioned himself between the door and the far corner of the room, where a man was crouched with his back against the wall, and both hands visible, and his eyes tracking every point of entry with the steady, continuous attention of someone who had learned, over a very long time, in conditions that most people in this building would not have been able to picture, that the moment you stopped watching was the moment things went wrong. The dog was not growling now. It had been growling before. That was the other sound that had preceded the tray. A low, sustained warning that the staff in the hallway had described variously as terrifying, animal, wrong. But now the dog was silent, and it was watching the woman in the doorway with its head slightly lowered and its ears half up, which was not aggressive and was not relaxed, but was something in between that most people would not have known how to read. Larkin Mercer read it. She stopped at the threshold. She did not come further in. She kept her hands visible, her weight even, her voice at the same pitch it had been in the corridor. "Permission to enter, Staff Sergeant?" she said. The hallway had gone so quiet that the security officers outside could hear the fluorescent light buzz. The man in the corner, Marcus Reed, 38 years old, 6 years 2 inches, decorated in ways that most of his current care team had never troubled themselves to understand, looked at the woman in the doorway. He looked at her for a long time. 5 seconds. 8. Long enough that one of the security officers outside shifted his weight, and the other one put a hand out to stop him from doing anything about it. Marcus Reed exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not a sob or a gasp or anything that would have been described afterward as emotional. It was simply the sound of a man whose chest had been held rigid for 9 days, releasing a single controlled breath, the way a person does when they have been waiting for something and have finally recognized that it has arrived. Atlas sat down. The hallway stayed silent. Larkin stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Nobody on the 4th floor of Caldwell Ridge Veterans Medical Center in Harlow City knew in that moment who Larkin Mercer was. They knew she was 31. They knew she had transferred from the surgical unit 11 days ago in a staffing reshuffle that nobody had fully explained. They knew she was quiet, thorough, and notably resistant to the kind of institutional small talk that usually helped new staff establish themselves on a unit. They knew she had been assigned to room 412 on her third day, and had not once, in the 8 days since, requested a reassignment. That last part had produced a range of reactions ranging from grudging respect to active suspicion, depending on who you asked. What nobody knew, what Larkin had not volunteered and had not been asked to disclose beyond the minimum required in her hiring paperwork, was anything meaningful about the 6 years that preceded her nursing career. The injury, the recovery, the particular kind of knowledge that gets built in conditions that can't be replicated in a classroom. But that was the thing about knowledge like that. It didn't announce itself. It just changed how you saw things. If you're already feeling this story pull at something, stay with me. What happens inside this hospital over the next few days is going to make you angry, and then it's going to remind you why some people are exactly where they're supposed to be. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this halfway through. Drop a like if you're in it. And leave a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one goes. Now let's go back to where it really started. Larkin had been on the surgical unit for 3 weeks before the transfer came through, and she had been doing fine there. Fine in the functional, unremarkable sense of someone who was competent and showed up on time and didn't cause problems, which in a busy hospital is often the highest compliment available. The transfer request came as an internal memo on a Tuesday, routed through the nursing director's office. It didn't explain itself. It said she was needed on the 4th floor and that the reassignment was effective immediately. She asked the nursing director's assistant if there was a specific clinical reason. The assistant said she didn't have that information. Larkin accepted the assignment and showed up on the 4th floor the next morning at 6:58. Deborah Osei, the charge nurse, handed her a folder without quite looking at her. Marcus Reed, room 412, 38, Army veteran, 6 tours, service record partially classified. He has a retired military working dog named Atlas, who is certified and legally registered as a psychiatric service animal. Deborah's voice was the voice of someone reciting facts that had already cost her sleep. He's been here 9 days. 2 staff members are on modified duty after separate incidents in his room. His attending has requested nursing reassignment twice. He hasn't completed a single treatment session and has eaten approximately 30% of the meals delivered to him. Dishwal cheat? Betum. Larkin read the incident reports while Deborah talked. What were the triggers? Deborah stopped. What? For the incidents. What happened right before each one? A pause. The charge nurse looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. First one, an orderly tried to move the dog's sleeping mat without warning. Second one, an attending came in with 3 residents and didn't knock. Larkin nodded. She kept reading. You'll ask to transfer within the week, Deborah said. It wasn't cruel. It sounded like someone trying to be efficient about a predictable outcome. I haven't been in the room yet, Larkin said. She went to the room. She stood outside this door for 30 seconds. Not because she was afraid. She was assessing, doing what she always did before entering a space she didn't know, taking stock of what she could observe from the outside before committing to the threshold. The door had a small rectangular window. She could see part of the room from the angle. A bed that hadn't been slept in. A table with a meal tray sitting untouched. The corner of what might have been a dog bed near the window. She knocked twice. Said her name and her role and that she was going to open the door. Opened it. He was on the floor. Not in distress. Not in the way the incident reports had suggested she should expect. He was sitting with his back flat against the far wall, knees up, hands resting loose across them, in a position that was entirely deliberate. His back was covered. His sightlines to the door and the window were clear. Atlas was to his left in a posture that Larkin recognized, that had a name in the working dog community that most civilian hospital staff would never have heard. Both of them tracked her from the moment she stepped inside. The tracking was calm and complete and gave her nothing to be afraid of, and she wasn't. She pulled the visitor's chair a few feet inside the door and sat down without asking, keeping the distance deliberate. And she got out her blood pressure cuff and her notepad, and she started doing her job. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance. She didn't explain the treatment plan. She didn't ask him how he was feeling, which had apparently been the approach of multiple previous staff members, and had produced results that were now documented as incident reports. She took his vitals. She wrote them down. She asked 2 questions. How long since he'd slept more than 2 hours, and whether there was anything in the room that was creating a problem for him physically. He didn't answer for a while. Then he said, his voice raw from disuse, "You're not from psych. Surgical. They moved me up this week." He looked at her with the steady, measuring attention that she was going to come to understand was his baseline. "You're not scared." "Not at the moment." A pause. "They're usually scared by the door." "I heard." She finished her notes. "How long since you slept more than 2 hours?" 4 days, he said after a moment. "Maybe 5. She wrote it down. She told him she'd be back in the afternoon, and she left. She did not say anything encouraging. She did not say it would get better. She did not tell him they were going to work through this together, which she had seen in the previous nurse's notes, and which had apparently been the last thing said before the first incident. She closed the door the same careful way she'd opened it. She spent the next 2 hours at the nursing station with his file. Most of it she'd already read. But she went back through it more slowly this time, paying attention not just to what was there, but to what was missing. The places where the narrative skipped, where the dates had gaps, where the language in the medical notes shifted from specific to vague in ways that didn't track clinically. Marcus Reed had served 14 years, 6 deployments. His commendations were listed in language so compressed and procedural that you had to read them several times before the weight of what they were actually describing started to come through. 2 significant injury events. A medical discharge processed 18 months ago through a routing channel that Larkin recognized, not because she'd seen it recently, but because she'd seen it once before, a long time ago, in a context that was not available in her personnel file at Caldwell Ridge. The psychiatric diagnosis in his current file had been assigned on the day of admission by an attending who had spent 45 minutes with him. As far as Larkin could determine from the record, that attending had not consulted with anyone from Marcus's prior care team, had not reviewed the full service history, and had not, this was the one that sat in Larkin's chest with a specific weight, had not spoken to the handler who'd helped transition Atlas from active service to Marcus's care, despite that person being listed in the contact information Marcus had provided on intake. She read the admitting notes one more time, then she went back to room 412 for the afternoon check. He was at the table, not the floor, the table. It was a small thing, and she didn't mention it. "You didn't eat," she said, gesturing at the tray. "Not hungry." "When was the last time you were?" He looked at her. "You're going to keep asking practical questions. That's the job." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite humor, but was in its neighborhood. "The one before you asked me how I was feeling every 20 minutes for 3 days. I read that." She sat in the same chair as the morning, same distance, same angle. "How'd that go?" "I threw a tray." "Yeah." She opened her chart. "I need you to eat something before 6, not for you, for my paperwork." He ate half the meal. She logged it as a significant development and said nothing about it to anyone. But by day 5, he was at the table for every check. By day 6, he was answering questions without the long pauses, though the answers were still short and chosen with the care of someone who had learned not to give away more than necessary. By day 7, he asked her, quietly, like he was testing whether the information would be used against him, if the window could be cracked, because Atlas did better with moving air. Larkin checked. There was no clinical contraindication. She left it cracked. On day 8, while she was updating his fluid intake chart in the corner, and he was doing the particular kind of focused nothing that she'd come to recognize as the way his nervous system processed a quiet room, he said, "The food they're giving Atlas isn't right. He has a gastrointestinal condition. It's documented in his veterinary records. Nobody's looked at them." Larkin stopped writing. "I'll check." She found the veterinary records in the separate service animal documentation file that the animal care coordinator maintained, a file that was technically accessible to his care team and that appeared to have been accessed exactly once on the day of admission by someone who had not flagged anything in it. The dietary requirement was clearly noted. It had not been communicated to the animal handlers providing Atlas's meals. Larkin had it corrected within the hour and put a standing note in the care log so it couldn't lapse. That evening, Marcus said, "That's the first time in 9 days someone heard something I said and did something about it the same day." She looked up from the chart. It was a practical problem. The dog's diet needed to be addressed. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I mean. She held his gaze for a moment. I know what you mean, she said, and went back to writing. The trouble started arriving on day 10. It didn't come loudly. It came the way most institutional problems come, through process language and administrative routing and men with clipboards who had been sent to execute decisions made in rooms where Marcus Reed was not present and where the practical consequences of those decisions had not been seriously considered. Gary Fulton was the patient services liaison, and he appeared in the hallway outside 412 at 9:15 on the morning of day 10 with the well-maintained pleasantness of someone trained to deliver unwelcome information in a way that made opposition feel unreasonable. He was the kind of man who used words like trajectory and protocol alignment and stakeholder consensus in a way that seemed designed to make the listener feel that the situation was already settled, and they were simply being informed as a courtesy. He told Larkin, not Marcus, that following a legal review of the hospital's service animal policy as it applied to inpatient psychiatric settings, Atlas would need to be transferred to the hospital's approved animal care facility. For what duration? Larkin asked. Fulton's expression remained pleasant. That will be assessed on an ongoing basis relative to the patient's treatment progress. That isn't a timeline. It's the available answer at this point in the process. Larkin looked through the window in the door. Marcus was at the table with Atlas beside him, one of the dog's front paws resting on the toe of Marcus's boot, a small, specific contact that had been the first stable behavioral pattern she'd documented. The thing Atlas did when the room was quiet and Marcus was somewhere in his own head that required anchoring. I'm going to formally object to this before it moves forward, she said. Fulton made a note. That's your right. Your objection will be recorded. He left. Larkin spent the next 40 minutes documenting her objection in every channel available to her. The nursing notes, the patient communication log, and a formal incident flag that required a supervisor's signature and went into the administrative record. She pulled Marcus's file again and read the sections about Atlas's role in his care, the intake documentation, the service animal certification, the handler's notes from his discharge coordination. Then she wrote a second document. This one she did not enter into the hospital system. She saved it to her personal records. Dr. Sylvia Tran had been the psychiatric unit director for 7 years, and she was good at her job in the measurable ways that institutional medicine tracked: patient throughput, treatment completion rates, documentation compliance, staff performance reviews. She was organized, thorough, and operated with the specific confidence of someone who had been correct frequently enough that doubt had gradually become more irritating than useful. The meeting the next morning lasted 9 minutes, and it was not a meeting in any collaborative sense of the word. It was a notification with the formal structure of a conversation. The animal transfer is proceeding at noon, Tran said, standing at her desk in a way that foreclosed the possibility of this being a discussion. This is an administrative and legal determination. It does not fall within the scope of clinical override. I've documented my objection on patient safety grounds, Larkin said. I'd like confirmation that the attending of record has reviewed that documentation before the transfer proceeds. Your objection is in the system. That's not what I asked. A pause. Tran's expression held. Standard protocol for administrative decisions doesn't require attending physician review. Separating a psychiatric inpatient from a medically indicated service animal without clinical input isn't covered under standard administrative protocol. It's a clinical decision with administrative packaging. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Larkin had been in enough rooms with enough authority figures to know that what happened in silences like this was not reflection. It was decision. The person across from her was deciding not what to do about the problem, but what to do about her. Your concern is noted, Tran said. The transfer proceeds at noon. If you take any action to prevent or delay the transfer, it will be treated as insubordination and will be addressed accordingly. Larkin left the office. What she learned later from Deborah, who heard it from someone in HR, who probably shouldn't have said anything and said it anyway, was that before noon that day, Tran had sent an email to the nursing director recommending Larkin's immediate removal from the unit. The language she used was resistant to clinical authority and disruptive to the therapeutic environment. The email had been sent before the transfer even happened, before Larkin had done anything other than file paperwork and ask questions. That detail, when she found out about it, told her everything she needed to know about what was actually happening here and why. But she didn't know it yet when she was walking down the hall at 11:47 and saw through the corridor window two animal handlers pushing through the stairwell door with a transport leash and the particular expressions of people who'd been given an unpleasant assignment and were trying to get through it efficiently. She moved before she had made a decision to move. Her body simply went, and her mind caught up while she was already walking, and she was through the door to room 412 while the handlers were still 20 feet away. Marcus was already standing. He'd seen them through the window. She would never know exactly when, but he'd seen them before she came in because he always saw everything before anyone else in the room knew there was something to see. The careful steadiness of the past 9 days had retracted completely, like something living pulling back into a shell, and he was on his feet with Atlas in front of him and his eyes moving between the window and the door with the speed and precision of someone doing real-time threat assessment. Marcus. She kept her voice exactly the way she'd kept it for 11 days. Level, specific, without noise in it. They're coming to take Atlas. I've filed formal objections through every channel I have, but I need you to stay calm and let me handle the next few minutes. They cannot take that dog. Not a question, not a negotiation. A statement of operational fact delivered with the absolute flatness of someone who has identified a line. I know, I'm working on it. Stay with me. You don't understand what I'm telling you. He looked at her directly, and whatever had softened over 9 days of small and careful work was still there underneath. She could see it. But right now, it was buried under something older and more practiced. This isn't a preference. This isn't about comfort. My neurological regulation requires that animal the same way it requires a functioning brainstem. If he leaves this room, I will not be able to remain in a state that is safe for myself or anyone near me. I am telling you this as a clinical fact, not as a behavior warning. She had written this 3 times. In the nursing notes, in the incident flag, in the document she'd saved to her own records. I hear you, she said. I'm not letting them through without a fight, but I need you to stay calm so I can have the fight. The door opened behind her. Carrie was the lead handler, Sharbasa. Larkin had spoken with her twice before and found her professional and careful, and she came in with Tom behind her, and both of them had the look of people doing a job they'd been instructed to do and would feel better once it was done. Mr. Reed, Carrie said, keeping her voice even, we're here to transfer Atlas to the hospital's animal care facility. This is a temporary... Atlas moved. No aggression, no sound. The dog simply repositioned from his resting stance to a full block position directly between Carrie and Marcus, with his weight forward and his head level. And the communication was so clear and so complete that Carrie's sentence simply stopped existing. I am formally objecting to this transfer on patient safety grounds, Larkin said. I'm asking both of you to pause and allow me to reach the attending physician before this proceeds. We have authorization from administration, Tom said. Administrative authorization doesn't override documented patient safety concerns filed through clinical channels. We've been given specific instructions. I understand that. I'm asking for 20 minutes. The room was very still. Atlas hadn't moved. Marcus hadn't moved. Larkin was standing between the handlers and the corner of the room, and she was aware, in a specific and not entirely comfortable way, that this situation had a small number of possible next steps, and most of them ended badly. Then the voice came from the corridor. Not loud, not theatrical. The voice of someone who had given orders in conditions where the orders actually mattered, and where the difference between calm and controlled was everything. Nobody moves. Larkin turned. There were 3 people in the corridor beyond the open door. 2 men and 1 woman, all in Army service dress uniform. The insignia was specific and legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and Larkin knew what she was looking at. The lead officer, tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of posture that wasn't about presentation, but about years of carrying weight correctly, came through the door first, and his eyes swept the room in a single complete motion and settled on Marcus. Staff Sergeant Reed, he said, stand down, you're covered. The effect was immediate and absolute. 11 days of painstaking, incremental work. 11 days of careful distance and practical questions, and not asking how he felt, and fixing the dog's food, and leaving the window cracked, and showing up at the same time every afternoon, and doing nothing that couldn't be defended as a nursing function. 11 days of building something fragile and necessary in a room that the institution had been trying to dismantle since day one. All of that was still there. But right now what Marcus Reed needed was not what Larkin had been giving him. What he needed was what had just walked through the door. He exhaled. His shoulders dropped. His jaw unclenched. He sat down in the chair behind him with the specific quality of someone whose body has just been told that the watch is over and someone else has the perimeter. Atlas sat down beside him and put his head on Marcus's knee. The two handlers left without being asked twice. The officer's gaze moved to Larkin. It went to her badge, came back to her face, and stayed there for a moment. "Mercer?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her for another beat. Then he set a folder on the table, thick, with routing codes on the cover that Larkin hadn't seen in several years but recognized immediately. And he looked at both of them. "There's a situation," he said. "It's been developing for longer than either of you knows, and both of you are already in the middle of it." He opened the folder. The first page was not about Marcus Reed. It was about Larkin Mercer. Her photograph, her full name, her service record, not the abbreviated version in her Caldwell Ridge file, but the real one. The one she hadn't shown anyone at this hospital, the one with the dates and the deployments and the classification codes. Below her photograph was a single typed line that she read twice before she looked up. "We've known where you were for 3 months, the officer said, "and we've been watching what you've been doing in this room. We need to have a conversation about what's really happening inside this hospital." Marcus looked at her from across the table. Atlas hadn't moved. The folder was open and there were more pages beneath hers, and whatever was on them had brought 3 Army officers and a Department of Defense routing stamp to a psychiatric unit in Harlow City on a Tuesday afternoon. The afternoon shift was starting outside. She could hear the unit changing over, the normal sounds of a normal hospital day. None of the people out there knew what had just walked in. None of them knew yet what was coming. The officer's name was Colonel David Rice, and he did not sit down. He stood at the end of the table with the folder open in front of him and let the silence do its work for a moment. Not for effect, not for drama, but because he was a man who had learned over a long career that the first 30 seconds after delivering unexpected information were the most diagnostic. People revealed things in those seconds that they'd spent years training themselves not to reveal in the seconds that followed. Larkin looked at the page with her name on it, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific vertigo of having a carefully maintained separation collapse without warning. 2 lives that she'd kept in different compartments were now in the same room, and the room was a psychiatric ward in a hospital where she'd been a floor nurse for 11 days, and there was nothing to do about it except stay present and figure out what came next. She looked up at Rice. "How long have you actually been watching this unit?" "We've had eyes on Caldwell Ridge for 6 weeks. You arriving changed our timeline." "I didn't arrive. I was transferred here through a staffing reshuffle." Rice looked at her steadily. "We know. The implication settled. Larkin let it." She looked at Marcus, who was sitting with Atlas's head still on his knee and his hands flat on the table, and his eyes moving between Larkin and Rice in a way that suggested he was doing the same kind of calculation she was. Assembling a picture from insufficient information, rapidly, the way you did when waiting for complete information wasn't an option. "What's in the rest of that folder?" Marcus asked. His voice was steady, but there was an edge under it that Larkin recognized. Not anger, not fear, but the specific quality of a man who has learned through long experience that the people who say you're covered sometimes mean something more complicated than it sounds. Rice looked at him. 17 other veterans." The room stayed quiet for a moment. "Patients?" Larkin said. "Former patients, some current." Rice turned to the second page in the folder and slid it across the table toward her. "Caldwell Ridge has been receiving a specific population of veterans through what looks on paper like normal admissions referral channels. Primarily special operations background, primarily combat trauma presentation, primarily with classified or partially classified service records. The clinical pattern in their files is consistent across cases in ways that are statistically improbable if you're looking at independent clinical judgments." Larkin looked at the page. It was a summary table. Names redacted, case numbers assigned, dates of admission and discharge. Some of the discharge entries had notations. She read 2 of them before she understood what she was reading, and then she kept reading anyway because stopping wasn't going to change what the page said. They were misdiagnosed, she said. In the charitable interpretation, Rice said, yes. And the less charitable interpretation? He looked at her without answering for a moment. That's what the investigation is determining. Marcus's hands moved on the table. Not much. A slight shift, a repositioning. But Larkin noticed it because she'd been noticing his hands for 11 days. You're telling me that what happened to me that I wasn't some isolated? No, Rice said. You were not isolated. A silence. Atlas lifted his head from Marcus's knee and looked at the door, then back at Marcus, then settled again. The dog's internal monitoring system running its continuous loop, the same way Marcus's did, the same way Larkin's was running right now underneath the surface of her face. Who inside this hospital? She asked. That's also what the investigation is determining. Colonel? She kept her voice even. I've been on this unit for 11 days. I've filed 3 separate formal objections in the last 48 hours that went up the chain to Dr. Tran and above. If there are people inside this building who are aware of an ongoing investigation and also aware that I'm generating documentation that conflicts with the institutional narrative, we know, Rice said. That's why we moved today instead of next week. She sat with that for a second. Am I a target? Rice looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how much of the truth was operationally useful right now. You've created friction in a system that was operating without it. That makes you visible to people who would prefer you weren't. That's not an answer. It's the honest version of one. One of the other officers, a woman whose name Larkin hadn't caught, whose insignia put her somewhere in the JAG structure, leaned forward slightly. Miss Mercer, at this stage, we need to ask you some questions about specific observations you've made during your time on this unit, not about Sergeant Reed specifically, about the broader operational patterns of the ward. I want it on record, Larkin said, that I have formal objection documentation in 3 separate places in this hospital system right now, and that those documents may be at risk of modification or disappearance if the wrong people find out this conversation is happening. Rice looked at the JAG officer. Something passed between them. The JAG officer took out a tablet and made a note. We'll need copies, she said. I have them. Larkin had the copies in her own records, the ones she didn't keep in the hospital system. She'd learned that habit somewhere she didn't talk about, and right now she was grateful for it in a way that sat in her chest like a stone. She reached into the folder she'd been carrying since she left the nursing station 40 minutes ago, the one she'd had under her arm when she walked down this hallway to stop 2 handlers from taking a dog. And she put her personal documentation on the table. Rice looked at it. He looked at her. You've been building a parallel record, he said. I've been doing my job, she said. The parallel record is what happened when I noticed the institutional one had gaps. The conversation in room 412 lasted an hour and 20 minutes. And at the end of it, Larkin knew more than she'd known before, and less than she needed to, which was exactly the relationship she'd always had with operational information, and which she'd never fully made her peace with. What she knew, Caldwell Ridge Veterans Medical Center had been under covert investigation by a joint military DoD task force for approximately 6 weeks. The investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower complaint from a former employee, identity protected, details classified, that described a pattern of clinical mismanagement targeting veterans with classified or sensitive service backgrounds. The complaint had been specific enough and the pattern it described consistent enough that it had moved up chains quickly and landed somewhere with real resources behind it. What she knew, Marcus Reed was not the primary focus of the investigation, but his case was the most recent and the most legible, the one where the documentation trail was cleanest and the deviation from legitimate clinical practice was most clearly visible. What she knew, the people inside the hospital who were responsible for this pattern did not yet know that the investigation existed. The plan had been to maintain that gap for another week while the task force built out the evidence package. Her objection filings, which had been more aggressive and more specific than anything the investigation had anticipated from an insider this early, had pushed the timeline. What she didn't know, who exactly inside the hospital was responsible, how far up it went, what the mechanism was, and whether the people she'd been talking to every day for 11 days had any idea what was happening in their own institution, or had simply been moving through it like everyone else. Competent professionals executing processes they hadn't designed and hadn't questioned. That last part was the one that kept her in her chair longest. Because she'd watched Deborah Osei work for 11 days, and Deborah was decent and hardworking and visibly worn down by a system that seemed to grind against her constantly. She'd watched the orderlies and the nursing assistants and the physical therapy staff, and most of them were people doing their jobs with real care inside an institution that was, apparently, doing something with their work that they didn't know about. And then there was Dr. Sylvia Tran, who had sent the reassignment email before Larkin had done anything other than file paperwork and ask questions. That told its own story, chat. Reese and his team left room 412 at 1:15 in the afternoon with Larkin's documentation copies and a secure contact number she was to use only from outside the building. The plan, as outlined, was straightforward on its surface. She was to continue her normal nursing duties, document everything she observed in her personal records as well as the hospital system, and not change her behavior in any way that would signal to the people inside the institution that anything had changed. Essentially, keep doing what she'd been doing. Don't react to what she now knew. She had done this before. It was not comfortable, but it was familiar. What was less familiar was the additional instruction Rice delivered at the door, quietly, before he left. There's going to be a point, he said, in the next 48 to 72 hours, where the institutional pressure on your position here escalates significantly. We expect this to take the form of formal disciplinary action, probably a suspension recommendation, possibly something more aggressive. When that happens, do not fight it through internal channels. Let it happen. We need the documentation trail to continue without institutional interference, and an internal dispute will muddy it. She looked at him. You want me to accept a disciplinary action I don't deserve. I want you to trust the larger process. And if the disciplinary action includes removal from the unit, a pause. We'll move before it gets to that point. He left. She stood in room 412 for a moment after the three officers were gone, in the quiet that remained, and Atlas looked at her from across the room with the steady attention he gave to everything. Marcus was watching her. How much of that did you already know? None of the specifics. But you knew something was wrong. She looked at him. I knew what I was seeing in your chart didn't match what I was seeing in this room. I didn't know what was behind it. He was quiet for a moment. What happens to you if they come after your job? Nothing good, she said, and picked up her chart folder. How's your pain level today? I never actually got to the rest of your vitals. He stared at her. Marcus, pain level. 4, he said after a moment. She wrote it down and went back to work. The rest of that shift passed in the way that terrible shifts sometimes do, with an outward normalcy so complete it felt like performance. Larkin did her medication rounds. She updated charts. She attended the afternoon handoff briefing and said nothing that wasn't a nursing function, and answered questions about 2 other patients she was covering, and did not once let her face do anything other than the focused, slightly tired expression of a floor nurse in the middle of a full day. Dr. Tran was not on the floor that afternoon. Her name appeared in the system as having left at 12:30 for an off-site administrative meeting. That absence, which would have been unremarkable yesterday, now carried a different weight. At 4:40, Deborah stopped by the nursing station where Larkin was finishing documentation and said, without particular emphasis, heard there was some activity in 412 this afternoon. Larkin kept typing. The service animal removal was called off. There were some people from a Federal Department of Veterans Affairs review office who came by. Deborah looked at her. Federal review? Routine inspection. They had credentials. Every word technically accurate. Deborah said nothing else, but she stood at the station for a moment longer than she needed to, and her expression had the quality of someone turning something over, and Larkin did not help her with it in either direction. She drove home that night and sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for 11 minutes before going inside, which was not something she usually did and which she would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked. She ate something she didn't taste. She sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop and entered everything from the day into her own records. Not just the observations and the documentation, but the timeline, the specific language Rice had used, the things he hadn't answered. She saved it in 3 places. Then she lay down on her bed in the dark and did not sleep for a very long time, which was also not something she usually did. And she let herself sit with the specific discomfort of knowing more than she was supposed to show and less than she needed to act, which was a discomfort she recognized because she'd lived inside it before and had survived it before and was going to survive it now. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. Atlas was in room 412. Marcus was in room 412. 17 redacted case numbers were in a folder that was now in a military vehicle somewhere in Harlow City. She closed her eyes. The next morning arrived at 6:45 with the specific quality of a morning that had been planned by someone else and was going to proceed on its own schedule regardless of what she'd spent the night thinking about. She was on the unit by 7:10. Deborah was already there. The overnight notes were routine. Marcus had actually slept, the overnight nurse's log said, 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was the longest documented sleep period since his admission. Atlas had eaten without incident. Larkin read that and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the vicinity of both. She did her first round, and the morning was normal until 9:20, when it stopped being normal. She was at the medication cart outside room 408 when she heard Deborah's voice from the nursing station with a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not alarm exactly, but the controlled tightness of someone receiving information they didn't like through a professional channel that required them to receive it professionally. Larkin finished the medication documentation, returned the cart, and walked to the nursing station. Deborah put the phone down. She looked at Larkin with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and wasn't fully making it. HR wants to see you. 11 o'clock. Larkin kept her face exactly where it was. About? They didn't specify. A pause. It came through Tran's office. Okay. Larkin. Deborah stopped herself. Started again. I don't know what... She stopped again. 11 o'clock. 6th floor. Larkin nodded and went back to her rounds. She was not surprised. She had been told to expect this. Knowing it was coming and experiencing it arriving were two different things, and she let herself sit with the gap between them for exactly the time it took her to walk from the nursing station to room 412, where she knocked twice and entered and found Marcus doing something she hadn't seen him do before. He was standing at the window with one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the street below, and the posture wasn't guarded. It was just a man standing at a window. Atlas was lying in a patch of light by the wall. You look like something happened, Marcus said, without turning around. HR meeting at 11. Tran's office initiated it. He turned then. They're moving on you. Looks that way. His jaw tightened. Because of yesterday. Because you stood in that doorway and didn't... Probably because of the 11 days before that, too. She sat in her chair. It's fine. It's expected. It's not fine. Marcus, they're going to do exactly what they were always going to do, she said, and she was aware that her voice had gone to a register she didn't usually use with him. Not softer, exactly, but more direct. And it was always going to happen because of what I was observing and documenting, not because of anything I did wrong. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. You knew this was coming. She didn't answer that directly. How's the pain level this morning? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, complicated in the specific way of someone who wants to say something and has decided not to, but wants you to know the decision was made. 3, he said. She wrote it down. The HR meeting was on the 6th floor in a conference room that had the specific impersonal quality of a room designed for conversations that the institution needed to have on record. There were 2 people there. A woman from HR named Patricia Gould, who had the careful expressiveness of someone who'd attended a lot of these meetings and had learned to remove her face from the proceedings, and a man from hospital administration named Neil Storrow, who was doctor, Tran's administrative supervisor, and who had the look of someone who would have preferred not to be here but had been required to attend. They offered her water. She declined. Patricia Gould opened a folder. Ms. Mercer, this meeting is in response to a formal concern raised regarding your conduct on the 4th floor psychiatric unit. Specifically, a series of incidents over the past 48 hours in which you are alleged to have obstructed a sanctioned administrative procedure and conducted yourself in a manner inconsistent with the hospital's professional standards policy. Larkin looked at the folder. I'd like copies of the specific allegations in writing. Those will be provided. I'd like them before we proceed. A pause. Patricia Gould looked at Neil Storrow. He gave a very small nod. She printed them and slid them across the table. Larkin read them carefully. The language was precise in the way that HR language was always precise. Specific enough to sound factual, vague enough to resist direct challenge. The core allegation was that she had obstructed the lawful transfer of a service animal, exceeded her nursing authority in engaging directly with administrative operations personnel, and demonstrated a pattern of insubordination towards senior clinical staff. The phrase pattern of insubordination was doing a lot of work. I have documentation of my formal objections through proper channels, she said. I have the timestamps. I have the content. The objections were filed before any of the actions described here as obstruction occurred. We're aware of the documentation, Patricia Gould said. Then the record is clear that I followed established procedure. The concern isn't procedural, Neil Storrow said. It was the first time he'd spoken. The concern is cultural. Dr. Tran has described a pattern of resistance to clinical hierarchy that affects unit functioning. Larkin looked at him. I'd like Dr. Tran's specific observations in writing as well. Another pause. Those will also be provided. Thank you. She folded her hands on the table. I'm prepared to respond to every specific allegation on record. I'd also like to note that this meeting is occurring 22 hours after I was present during an inspection visit from Federal Review personnel, and I think that timing is something the hospital may want to be careful about. The room went very still. Neil Storrow looked at Patricia Gould. Patricia Gould looked at the folder. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence had a different quality than the silence that had preceded it. Denser, more pressurized, the quality of a room where the ground has shifted and nobody is ready to acknowledge it yet. We'll take that under advisement, Patricia Gould said carefully. I'd appreciate that. Larkin stood. I'll expect the written documentation within the hour. Is there anything else? There wasn't. She left the conference room and stood in the elevator for the 30 seconds it took to return to the 4th floor and let herself feel the specific trembling in her hands that had started somewhere around the phrase pattern of insubordination and hadn't stopped yet. Not fear? Not quite. More like the physiological response to sustained pressure finally finding a moment to surface, which was normal, which was human, which she was allowing herself precisely because the elevator was empty and the doors were closed, and she had 30 seconds before she had to put it away again. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. She put it away. What? The written documentation arrived at 12:50 in her hospital email. She forwarded it from her phone to her personal account and then to the secure contact address Rice had provided. 15 minutes later, her phone buzzed with an acknowledgement from a number she didn't recognize that was 1 digit off from the contact number Rice had given her, which meant it was coming through a routed line rather than directly, which she understood. She went back to her rounds. The afternoon should have been quiet after that. It wasn't. At 2:30, one of the nursing assistants named Priya, young, conscientious, the kind of person who double-checked everything because she was still at the stage of her career where she was more afraid of making mistakes than of speaking up, pulled Larkin aside in the medication room and said, in a voice pitched low and careful, I don't know if this is something, but I've been seeing something for a few weeks and I don't know who to tell. Larkin looked at her. Tell me. Priya took a breath. The patient files. The flagged ones. The ones with partial classifications on their service records. There's a person from administration who comes up to the floor after hours and accesses them. Not to update them, just to access them. I've seen it twice on the overnight log when I came in early, and I mentioned it to Deborah once and she told me to let it go. Larkin's chest did something she didn't show. Did you note the access timestamps? Priya hesitated. I took a photo of my screen when I saw it the second time because it felt wrong and I didn't know what to do with it. How long ago was the second time? 4 days ago. Priya. Larkin kept her voice absolutely level. I need you to send me that photo right now from your phone to mine. And then I need you to go about your afternoon as if this conversation didn't happen. Priya looked at her. Something in Larkin's expression either reassured her or frightened her enough to produce the same result, because she got out her phone and sent the photo without further discussion. Larkin looked at the photo. The timestamp on the access log was 3:47 in the morning. The account name accessing the files was not a clinical staff account. It was an administrative account registered to the director of hospital operations, a man named Robert Calloway, whose name Larkin knew from the institutional org chart and had never personally encountered. She sent the photo to the secure contact number. She stood in the medication room for a moment with her phone in her hand, and she thought about Rice's instruction. Don't fight the disciplinary action through internal channels. Let it happen. Trust the larger process. She thought about the 17 redacted case numbers. She thought about what some never recovered meant when you let yourself actually think about what it meant. Then she put her phone away and went back to the floor. At 4:15, Deborah found her at the nursing station. The charge nurse looked like she'd been carrying something heavy for the last 2 hours and had decided abruptly to put part of it down. She sat on the edge of the desk in a way that wasn't authorized, but also wasn't something anyone was going to say anything about, and she kept her voice low. "The flagged files," she said. Larkin looked at her. "I know what you're thinking," Deborah said. "And I know that when Priya came to me, I told her to leave it alone. I told her that because—" She stopped, started again, and her voice had lost some of its professional smoothing. "I told her that because 3 months ago I flagged something similar, and 2 days later I was in an HR meeting about a documentation error from 8 months prior that nobody had cared about until I flagged something similar." The medication cart hummed. "What did you flag?" Larkin asked. "Discharge paperwork discrepancies. Veterans leaving with diagnoses that didn't match their documented presentation. Medications prescribed at discharge that weren't clinically indicated by anything in the file." Deborah's hands were flat on her thighs in a way that suggested she was keeping them deliberately still. "I was told it was a clerical issue being handled by the attending team." "Was it?" "I don't know. I stopped looking." Larkin said nothing for a moment. Then, "Deborah, I need to know one thing. Tran's reassignment email, the one she sent yesterday, recommending I be moved off the unit. Did you know about it before or after the handlers came to take Atlas?" Deborah went very still. "Before," she said quietly. "I saw a forwarded copy at 11:15. I should have told you. I didn't tell you because I didn't know what—" She stopped. "I didn't tell you because I was scared, and that was wrong." The afternoon light through the corridor windows had gone the specific flat gold of late day. Somewhere down the hall, an alarm beeped twice and silenced. "Okay," Larkin said. "That's all you're going to say?" "For now." Larkin looked at her. "Can I ask you to do something?" Deborah looked at her for a long moment. Whatever she was weighing, it showed on her face in a way she wasn't trying to hide. "Depends. Write down everything you told me just now. Times, dates, what you flagged, what happened after. Keep it somewhere that isn't a hospital system." Deborah's expression shifted. It moved through something complicated and landed somewhere that wasn't comfort, but was resolve. "Are you going to tell me what's actually happening?" "Not yet," Larkin said, "but I need you to trust that something is." Deborah looked at her for another moment. Then she got up off the desk and straightened her scrubs and became, visibly and deliberately, the charge nurse again. "I'll have it done by end of shift," she said in her normal voice. She walked away. Larkin turned back to the nursing station screen. Her email had a new message. It was from Neil Storo's office, time-stamped 4/12, and the subject line was 3 words: suspension, effective tomorrow. She read it once. The language was procedural and thorough. It cited the formal concern from Dr. Tran, the conduct issues from the HR meeting, and a catch-all clause about the hospital's right to place employees on administrative leave pending investigation. She was to report to HR tomorrow morning at 8 to return her badge. She forwarded the email to her personal account and to the secure contact number, and then she sat for a moment with the specific weight of it. Not because she was surprised, and not because she wasn't prepared, but because being prepared for something and feeling the impact of it were never the same thing, and she had learned not to pretend otherwise. Then she got up and went to do her final medication round of the shift. She stopped at room 412 last. Marcus was sitting at the table with Atlas on the floor beside him, and he was doing something she'd never seen him do before. He had a small notebook open in front of him, and he was writing in it, which seemed so ordinary and so significant at the same time that she stopped in the doorway for a second before he noticed her. He looked up. He read her face in about 1 second. They did it. Suspension, effective tomorrow morning. He closed the notebook. His expression was controlled, but underneath it something had sharpened in a way she recognized. What happens now? She came in and sat in her chair. She wanted to tell him that she knew what was coming, that Rice had said they'd move before it got to removal, that the process was in motion and what was happening to her was part of the architecture of something larger. She wanted to give him the comfort of information, but Rice had said don't change your behavior and don't signal that anything had changed, and telling Marcus more than he already knew counted as changing her behavior. Now I go home, she said, and I come back tomorrow morning to return my badge. And then? She looked at him. And then I trust that what I built in this room over 11 days doesn't disappear because somebody signed a piece of paper. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Atlas lifted his head. The dog looked at the door and then back at Larkin with the specific, unreadable attention that she'd been reading for 11 days and still couldn't fully decode. There's something you're not telling me, Marcus said. She picked up her chart folder. There are a lot of things I'm not telling you. That's been true since day one. But this is different. She looked up from the folder and met his eyes. And for a moment, the professional boundary between what she could say and what she couldn't was the only thing in the room. Get some sleep tonight, she said. Real sleep. More than 4 hours. She left room 412 for what she didn't know yet would be the last time in a very long way. She was almost at the elevator when her phone buzzed. Not the hospital phone. Her personal phone, with the number she'd been given for emergencies only. The message was 4 words. Tomorrow. 6 a.m. Don't come in. She stared at it. Then a second message arrived, 30 seconds after the first, from the same number. They found Priya's photo. She's already been called into admin. Larkin's hand tightened around the phone. The elevator opened. She stood there for a second, suspended between the floor she was leaving and the one she'd be going to. And the thing she'd been managing since yesterday afternoon, the careful architecture of knowing what she knew and not showing it, developed a crack. Not a collapse, just a crack. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. And in room 412 at the end of the hall, Atlas stood up. The drive home took 18 minutes, and she didn't remember any of it. She was in her apartment with her keys still in her hand before she fully registered that she'd parked and walked up 2 flights of stairs and unlocked the door. And she stood in the entry hallway for a moment with the lights off, and the city making its ordinary sounds outside the window. And she thought about Priya, 24 years old, conscientious, the kind of person who took a photo of a screen because something felt wrong and she didn't know what else to do with that feeling. Larkin put her keys down on the counter and opened her laptop. She sent a message through the secure contact line. Priya Nair, nursing assistant, 4th floor. She's the one who identified the after-hours access. She's already been pulled into administration. She needs to be protected before 8 a.m. tomorrow. She sent it, and then she sat with the silence of not knowing whether it would matter, which was a kind of silence she had more experience with than she wanted. While she waited, she opened her personal documentation file and added everything from the day, the HR meeting, Storo's specific language, Deborah's admission about the flagged files, the discharge paperwork discrepancies, the timeline of the suspension email. She wrote it all in the flat, factual language she'd trained herself to use for records that might someday need to be read by people who hadn't been in the room, where every word choice would carry weight, and where approximately and seemed and appeared were the enemies of credibility. She finished at 9:47. Her phone buzzed at 9:51. The secure number. 1 line. Nair's being contacted tonight. Don't communicate with her directly. Then 30 seconds later, stay home in the morning. We mean it. She set the phone down. She did not sleep. At 5:58 in the morning, she was sitting at her kitchen table with coffee she'd made 2 hours earlier and hadn't finished, watching the light change outside the window when her phone rang. Not the secure number, her regular number. The caller ID said Caldwell Ridge, Maine. She answered it. Ms. Mercer. The voice was Neil Storo's, and it had something in it that hadn't been there yesterday. A tightness, a specific quality of a man who'd been awake for a while and was managing something he hadn't expected to be managing. I'm calling to ask you to come in this morning. My suspension is effective today. There's been a development. I'd ask you to come in at 8 as previously scheduled. For the badge return? A pause. For a meeting. There are people here who need to speak with you. She let the silence run for a moment. What kind of people? Another pause, longer. Federal, he said, and the word came out with a quality that suggested he hadn't expected to be using it and wasn't sure what it meant for him that he was. Please come in at 8, Ms. Mercer, please. She looked at the lightning window. I'll be there, she said. She sent a single message to the secure line. They called me in. Storo, Federal Presence. I'm going in. The response came back in under 2 minutes. We know. We'll be there. Don't talk to anyone before you talk to us. She arrived at Caldwell Ridge at 7:50, and the lobby was wrong immediately. Not visibly wrong in any way that would have registered to someone who didn't know what to look for. There were still patients being checked in at the front desk, and an orderly pushing a transport chair, and a man at the coffee kiosk reading something on his phone. But there were also 2 people in the lobby who weren't patients and weren't staff, and who had the specific quality of people maintaining a posture of ordinary presence while performing an entirely different function. She knew the posture. She'd worn it herself. She went to the elevator and went up to the 4th floor, and when the doors opened, the unit was operating at what looked like a normal morning shift but felt like a stage set. Deborah was at the nursing station with the controlled stillness of someone who had been told something and was holding it very carefully. She looked at Larkin, and something moved across her face that was complicated and grateful and scared in equal measure. Conference room B, Deborah said quietly. Second door on the left past the attending's office. They're already in there. Who's with Marcus? Overnight nurse is finishing her shift. He's okay. He knows something's happening. He asked about you at 6. Larkin nodded. She walked to conference room B and knocked once and opened the door. Grace was there. The JAG officer from 2 days ago, whose name was Major Renata Solis, she learned now, was there. 2 people Larkin hadn't seen before. A woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Special Agent Diane Farrow from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and a man in his 50s named Howard Pretch, who was the U.S. Attorney's Office representative and who had the specific, unhurried demeanor of a man who had been building cases for 30 years and had learned that urgency was a resource to be managed, not expressed. Neil Storo was in the corner with his arms folded and the look of a man who had walked into a meeting expecting to be managing it and had discovered very recently that he was not. Larkin sat down. Farrow opened without preamble. Miss Mercer, I want to be direct with you about where we are. Yesterday afternoon, a nursing assistant on this floor provided us with documentation of unauthorized access to classified adjacent veteran medical records. That access was traced to an administrative account belonging to Robert Calloway, the hospital's director of operations. Mr. Calloway was placed under federal hold at 11:30 last night. Storo made a small sound in the corner. Larkin kept her face where it was. The access logs we've recovered through the investigation cover an 18-month period, Farrow continued. During that period, Mr. Calloway accessed the files of 23 veterans whose service records contained either full or partial classification markers. In 14 of those cases, the access was followed within 72 hours by a modification to the patient's clinical documentation, specifically to the attending physician's diagnostic and treatment notes. The room was quiet. Someone was changing the files, Larkin said. The files were being changed, Farrow said precisely. We are still establishing the full chain of instruction. What we can demonstrate at this stage is that the changes were consistent in direction, amplifying indicators of psychiatric instability, removing or minimizing notations that would support alternate clinical interpretations, and consistent in timing relative to Mr. Calloway's access. Larkin thought about Marcus's admitting notes. The way the language had felt slightly wrong to her in places, slightly more conclusory than the observations warranted. She thought about the 18 months of records and the 17 redacted case numbers that had become 23. And she thought about what some never recovered meant when you attached it to men and women who had come here for help. Dr. Tran, Larkin said. Dr. Tran has been placed on administrative leave pending interview, Farrow said. We are not yet in a position to characterize her role. Her reassignment email went out before the handlers came to take Atlas. She initiated disciplinary action against me within hours of my formal objections. If she wasn't aware of what Calloway was doing, she was at minimum responding to pressure from someone who was. That's what the investigation will determine. I have documentation of the timeline. We have your documentation. It's already in the evidence package. Pritch, who hadn't spoken yet, said, Miss Mercer, we'd like you to formally cooperate with this investigation as a material witness. That means a recorded statement today, continued documentation of your observations going forward, and availability for potential testimony in a federal proceeding. Yes, Larkin said. He looked at her like he'd been prepared for more resistance. You don't need time to consider— No. He made a note. Rice, who had been standing near the window through all of this, finally spoke. There's something else. We've been in contact with the families of 4 veterans whose cases are flagged in the access logs. Veterans who were discharged from this facility in the past year and who have since experienced significant deterioration. 2 of them are currently hospitalized elsewhere. One of them— He stopped for a moment, which was the first time she'd seen him stop. One of them is not. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Larkin sat with it. She'd known, abstractly, since she'd read the folder 2 days ago, that the stakes were this. But abstract knowledge and a man saying one of them is not in a conference room on the 4th floor of the place where it happened were not the same thing. What do you need from me right now? She said. Your statement, Farrow said. And then we need you on this floor. Your suspension is being rescinded as of this morning. Storrow is going to document that. In the corner, Storrow nodded once with the expression of a man swallowing something that didn't go down easily. Before we start the statement, Larkin said, I need to check on my patient. Tati. She knocked on room 412's door and opened it, and Marcus was standing at the window again, same position as yesterday, one hand on the frame, looking out. The morning light was different from yesterday's. Harder, more direct, and it fell across the side of his face in a way that made him look older than 38, and also, somehow, more present than he had been at any point in the past 13 days. Atlas was at the door before she fully entered, not blocking her, just there, the dog's large head at the level of her hip. She put her hand on Atlas's back for a second, just briefly. They rescinded the suspension, she said. Marcus turned. He read her face the same way he always did, the complete rapid scan of someone for whom reading faces had been a survival skill before it was anything else. Something else happened. Yes. Bad? For some people. Not for you. She sat in her chair. It's moving now. What I told you was in motion. It's moving. But the next few days are going to be difficult on this unit, and I need you to be prepared for that. What kind of difficult? Staffing changes, administrative disruption, people asking you questions, not clinical staff, federal investigators. They'll come to you at some point. You have the right to have representation present. I'd encourage you to use it. He looked at her steadily. You knew 2 days ago this was coming. I knew something was coming 2 days ago. I didn't know what it would look like when it arrived. A pause. The officers. Rice. She looked at him. Marcus. I'm not asking you to breach anything. I'm asking you, was this about me, or was I part of something larger? She held his gaze. You were part of something larger. You are part of something larger. And the fact that you weren't more seriously harmed than you were is partly luck and partly because you were difficult to manage, which the institution counted as a problem and which I count as something else. Something moved through his expression. Not relief. It was more complicated than that. The specific feeling of something you've suspected being confirmed had its own quality, distinct from surprise, distinct from vindication, sitting somewhere between the two that didn't have a clean name. How many? He asked. 23 documented cases. His jaw moved. One didn't make it, she said quietly. He turned back to the window. Atlas moved to stand beside him, and Marcus's hand came down without thought and rested on the dog's head, and the two of them stood there looking at the street below, and Larkin let the silence be what it was. After a minute, he said, What do you need me to do? Right now? Eat your breakfast. Let the overnight nurse finish her handoff. When the investigators come to you, be as specific as you can about dates and times and what was said to you and when. And you? She stood up. I have a statement to give. The recorded statement took 3 hours. Farrow ran it with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what she needed and also knew that the usefulness of witness testimony depended on getting the witness to tell it in their own order before shaping it into the investigation's framework. So she mostly listened and asked clarifying questions that were pointed and specific and made notes that Larkin couldn't see. At the end, Farrow set down her pen and said, "One thing I want to be clear about. The documentation you built in parallel, the personal records, that was a significant factor in how quickly we were able to move yesterday. The institutional record had been compromised in ways that made it unreliable in several places. Your records weren't. I've kept personal documentation since my third day here," Larkin said. "Can I ask why?" Larkin thought about how to answer that. "I noticed the gaps," she said, "and I've been in enough situations where institutional memory was the only record that I learned not to rely on it exclusively." Farrow looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and also, underneath it, something else. The specific look of someone who has been doing this long enough to recognize when they're looking at someone who has been doing something else for just as long. "We may need you to speak to that in testimony," she said. "I understand." She left the conference room at 12:30, and her legs were unsteady in a way she didn't show, and her head had the specific heavy quality of having concentrated hard on precise language for 3 hours in a row. She went to the nursing station and ate half a granola bar from her bag, and drank water and sat for 5 minutes before anything else. Deborah came and sat beside her. "Calloway?" Deborah said quietly. "Yes. I saw him on this floor twice in the past 6 months, late. Both times he said he was doing a facilities inspection." She paused. "I logged it and didn't flag it because he was the director of operations and facilities inspections were plausible." "I know. I should have. You did what made sense with the information you had." Larkin looked at her. "That's all anyone can do." Deborah was quiet for a moment. "What happens to Tran?" "Investigation is ongoing." "But her access to this unit?" "She's been placed on administrative leave. She's not coming back to this floor." Deborah absorbed this. She had the look of someone reorganizing a significant portion of their understanding of the past several months, which was a cognitively demanding thing to do in real time. "The veterans she treated, the ones who were discharged. The investigators are in contact with families." "That's not what I—" Deborah stopped. "I need to know if I missed something, in my own patients, whether there was something I was seeing and not connecting to anything larger." Larkin looked at her. "If there is, write it down. Everything you can remember. Give it to me or give it directly to Special Agent Farrow on the 6th floor. Every detail matters." "Okay." A breath. "Okay." Passant. The afternoon was the strangest few hours Larkin had spent on a hospital floor, which was saying something given the previous 13 days. The unit looked the same. Same corridor, same fluorescent lights, same ambient sounds of a psychiatric ward in the middle of a Tuesday. But the texture of it had changed in a way she could feel, but couldn't have explained to someone who wasn't paying close attention. 3 people from the investigative team were on the floor, 2 in civilian clothes and 1 who hadn't bothered trying to blend. They had a conference room commandeered at the far end of the hall, and a steady stream of staff coming and going from it in short interviews that most people came out of looking like they'd run a mild foot race. Priya was among them. She came out at 2:15 looking wrung out but intact, and she and Larkin made eye contact in the hallway, and Priya gave a very small nod and kept walking, which was the right thing to do, and Larkin respected it. What nobody on the floor knew yet, what Larkin knew only because Rice had told her during a brief exchange in the hallway at 1:45, was that Calloway had not been acting alone, and that the second arrest was coming, and that the timeline for it was the next 12 to 18 hours. The second person was not inside this hospital. It was someone in the referral network, someone who had been selecting which veterans came to Caldwell Ridge and ensuring they arrived with preliminary documentation that made the subsequent clinical manipulation easier. Someone who had been operating at the front of a pipeline whose back end was what Larkin had been watching from room 412. She didn't have a name. Rice hadn't given her one. But knowing there was a second node out there, that this was a system rather than an institution, changed the geometry of what she understood she was standing inside. She went back to her rounds and was in the middle of updating a medication chart for a patient in 408 when the alert came through the unit intercom. Not a code, not the specific language of a patient emergency, which had its own vocabulary and cadence. What came through the intercom was an all-staff notification of an unscheduled federal law enforcement presence on the floor, requesting all non-essential staff to maintain position and allow federal personnel to move freely through the unit. For about 4 seconds, the entire floor stopped. Then Deborah's voice came through the internal channel, calm and professional, and carrying the weight of someone who had decided which version of herself was going to show up for this. All nursing staff, continue your assigned patient care. This is a federal administrative matter and does not affect clinical operations. If you have patient care concerns, reach me directly. The unit started moving again. Larkin finished the medication chart. She was at the nursing station 3 minutes later when 6 people came through the stairwell door, not the elevator, the stairs, moving with the unhurried, purposeful speed that meant they had a specific destination and had already mapped the route. Farrow was among them. 2 people in FBI tactical vests, and 2 others she didn't recognize whose credentials she clocked at the same time she registered that they were heading toward the attending's office, not the conference room. They went past her without stopping. She heard the attending's office door open. She heard Dr. Martin Helgrave, the attending physician who had been assigned to Marcus's case and whose clinical notes had been the ones modified, whether knowingly or not, say something in a raised voice that was quickly covered by another voice, lower and official. Then quiet. Then Farrow's voice, not loud but clearly audible in the corridor. Dr. Helgrave, you are not under arrest at this time. We need you to come with us voluntarily for an interview. I'm asking you not to make this something it doesn't need to be. Larkin did not watch. She kept her eyes on her screen. 2 minutes later, footsteps going back toward the stairwell. The door. Silence. Deborah appeared at the end of the corridor. She looked at Larkin from 30 feet away. Her expression asked a question she didn't say out loud. Larkin gave her nothing back. Not because she was being unkind, but because anything she gave Deborah right now would spread through the unit in 15 minutes, and the investigators needed the next few hours to be quiet. She turned back to her screen. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her a little. She checked on Marcus at 3:30. He was at the table with the notebook open, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who had been listening to the hallway and had cataloged everything that had happened on the floor in the past hour and had questions. Helgrave, he said, I can't confirm specifics. He was my attending. I know. Did he know? What was in the files? She sat down. This was the question she'd been turning over since Farrow's interview this morning, and she didn't have an answer she was confident in. I don't know, she said honestly. The investigation will determine that. If he knew, Marcus stopped. He put his pen down flat on the notebook and looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked up, his expression was the particular controlled kind that required visible effort. If he knew, then every conversation we had, every session, every assessment, yes. He was using the information. I don't know that. I know the files were modified. I know Calloway accessed them. The connection between those 2 things and Helgrave's awareness is what the investigators are determining right now. That's a very careful answer. It's the honest one. He was quiet for a long moment. Atlas put his chin on Marcus's forearm, the weight of it deliberate. The dog's version of the same thing Larkin had been providing for 13 days in a chair 4 feet from the wall. I want to testify, Marcus said. She looked at him. They'll ask you. I want to volunteer. I don't want to be a redacted case number. I want to be on record. That's your right. I'd encourage you to talk to an attorney before you make that decision. Jag can provide one. I've already made the decision. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her in the way he did when he'd already factored in her concerns and arrived at his answer before she'd finished delivering them. It was an infuriating quality in a patient, and she respected it completely. I'll tell Rice, she said. Is there something you can tell me about who else was involved? You said 23 cases. You said a referral network. She met his eyes. You're going to be a witness in a federal investigation, Marcus. I'm not going to tell you things that could complicate your testimony. He absorbed this. But it's bigger than this building. Yes. He looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon was doing whatever the afternoon did without regard for any of this. I've been in places, he said slowly, where the threat was inside the wire, where the people who were supposed to be on your side were the people you had to watch for. He stopped. I knew something felt wrong here. I knew from the second day, but I thought I was reading it wrong. I thought it was the diagnosis talking. You weren't reading it wrong. I know that now. He looked back at her. I knew it then too. I stopped trusting myself. Larkin didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you called for Atlas when Carrie and Tom came in. You held your position. You didn't comply with something that would have hurt you. I threw a tray. You threw a tray at a wall, not a person. She held his gaze. You were operating exactly right the whole time. The problem was never your assessment. The problem was the environment. He looked at her in the particular way he had of receiving information he'd already suspected, but needed to hear stated plainly before he could put it anywhere that was useful. Thank you, he said. It came out rough around the edges, which she thought was probably honest. You're welcome, she said, which was also honest. She left at 4, went back to her rounds, and was coming out of room 403 when Rice appeared at the end of the hall and gestured for her to come to the conference room. She came. He was alone in there this time. No JAG officer, no Pharaoh. He looked like a man who'd been on his feet since before 6 in the morning, which was probably accurate. The second arrest is tonight, he said. Not on this floor. At an office in the referral network. A veteran outreach coordination center on the other side of the city. The person running it has been the intake filtering point for this arrangement for approximately 2 years. Larkin sat down. How many veterans went through that filter? We're still establishing the full number. At minimum, the 23 we've documented. Potentially more. There are case files at the outreach center that we'll be accessing tonight under warrant. Potentially more, she repeated. Yes. She put this somewhere and left it there. What do you need from me tonight? Nothing tonight. Tomorrow we need you on this unit. The staff here are going to need someone who can hold the floor together while the formal investigation process is run. Deborah Osei can handle operational management, but she's going to need support. Understood. He looked at her. Mercer, I want to say something that's not operational. She looked at him. The documentation you built, the things you noticed and recorded before you had any reason to believe anyone was looking, that's not a standard response to a nursing assignment. It's the response of someone who has been trained to know what matters and to preserve it. He paused. Your service record is not something I discuss at work. I know. I'm not asking you to. He looked at the table briefly and then back at her. I'm saying that the reason those records held up, the reason Pharaoh could use them, is because of what you know how to do. And that the way you carried that into this room and into this unit and into the care of that patient, I wanted that to be said out loud. Larkin held the words for a moment. Thank you, she said, which was what she'd said to Marcus 40 minutes ago, which was apparently the only language adequate to 2 very different kinds of acknowledgement. She went back to the floor. Well, the 6 o'clock shift change was the most unusual one Larkin had seen at Caldwell Ridge. Not because anything was visibly different, the handoff process ran the same way it always ran. The incoming nursing staff took their assignments, the paperwork moved the way paperwork moved. But because every person in the room was carrying an awareness of what had happened on this floor today that they hadn't had access to this morning, and the weight of it was visible in how they moved and spoke and didn't speak. Larkin gave her handoff notes to the incoming nurse for her section and was at the elevator at 6:20 when her phone buzzed. Personal phone. A number she didn't recognize, not the secure line, not her regular contacts, a local number. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, and it was controlled in the way that something held very tightly is controlled, and it said, Is this Larkin Mercer, the nurse on the 4th floor? Yes. Who is... My name is Sandra Okafor. My husband was at Caldwell Ridge 4 months ago. He was discharged with a diagnosis of chronic delusional disorder and a medication protocol that we found a different doctor, and the second doctor said... Her voice broke, recovered, continued. I've been trying to reach someone at that hospital for 3 months. Nobody would talk to me. And then someone gave me your name. Larkin stood at the elevator with her hand not pressing the button. Mrs. Okafor, she said carefully, I want you to listen to me. I cannot speak with you in my capacity as hospital staff about a former patient, but there are federal investigators at Caldwell Ridge right now who need to speak with you tonight. I'm going to give you a number and I need you to call it within the next hour. A silence. Federal investigators? Yes. A longer silence. When Sandra Okafor spoke again, something had shifted in her voice. Not relief, not quite, but the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just been told that the ground under it is not, after all, their imagination. Is something happening? Is someone actually doing something? Yes, Larkin said. I promise you, someone is. She gave her Pharaoh's direct number and ended the call and stood in the hallway with the elevator doors in front of her and the ward behind her and the particular weight of that woman's voice still in her chest. She pressed the button. The elevator opened. Inside, going up rather than down, were two people she didn't recognize. Not hospital staff, not investigators she'd seen before. A man and a woman, both with the specific practiced stillness of people who had been somewhere difficult recently and were still recalibrating. The man was holding a folder. On the tab of the folder, in the notation system she recognized from 18 months of observing Caldwell Ridge's filing practices, was a case number. It was not one of the 23 she knew about. She looked at it for exactly 1 second before the elevator doors closed between them. She stood in the hallway and she did the math. And the math said something she hadn't been prepared for, which was that 23 was not the final number, that the folder going up in that elevator represented at least one case outside the access logs Calloway had been traced to, and that the investigation she'd thought was reaching its perimeter had just shown her it had further to go than anyone had told her. She pulled out her phone. She called the secure line. It rang 3 times. 4. On the 5th ring, not Rice, someone else, a voice she didn't recognize, tighter than Rice's, with the specific quality of a person managing an active situation. Mercer. There are 2 people in your building I don't recognize, she said. Going up. Not your team. The man is carrying a case file with a notation format that matches Caldwell Ridge's internal system. A pause. What floor did they get in on? Ground floor. Elevator, going up. Another pause, shorter. Get off the floor, take the stairs, go to the parking structure, and stay on the 2nd level until you hear from us. Her chest went cold. What now, Mercer? She was moving before the word finished. Behind her, somewhere on the 4th floor she was leaving, Atlas began to bark. One sharp sound, not the sustained warning from 2 days ago, but a single alarm note that she heard through the stairwell door just as it closed behind her, and the sound followed her down the stairs in a way that wasn't possible, but that she heard anyway, all the way to the 2nd level of the parking structure, where she stopped and pressed her back against a concrete pillar and waited. The parking structure was quiet. Her phone was in her hand. It didn't ring. She counted seconds. At 47 seconds, the building's fire alarm activated. Not a test cadence, the full sustained pulse of an actual activation. And through the concrete ceiling above her she could hear it, and she could hear, faint but unmistakable, the sound of multiple sets of feet moving fast. Then a sound she hadn't expected. A door. Somewhere in the parking structure. Not the stairwell she'd come from. The other side. Opening. She pressed harder against the pillar and did not move and did not breathe and listened. Footsteps on concrete. One person. Moving fast, then slowing. The kind of slowing that meant someone was looking for something. Or someone. Her phone buzzed in her hand, silent, a text. She looked at it without moving anything but her eyes. Don't move. We have eyes on the structure. Stay exactly where you are. She stayed. The footsteps stopped. 10 meters from her pillar, in the shadow between 2 parked cars, she could see the outline of a man she didn't recognize. Not the man from the elevator, someone different, someone who had been here before she arrived, standing very still, looking in her direction. He hadn't seen her, not yet. He stood between 2 parked cars with his weight forward and his head turning slowly, doing exactly what she would have done in his position, quartering the space, moving his scan from close to far, near pillar to far wall, ground level to vehicle roofline. She had done this before, not in a parking structure in Harlow City, in places with different names and different light and different stakes, but the mechanics were the same. And the mechanics were what her body remembered while her mind was occupied with the specific problem of staying completely still, when every instinct was generating data about angles and distances and the gap between where she was and the stairwell door behind her. The gap was 11 meters. Approximately. Against a man who was already looking, she stayed where she was. The phone in her hand buzzed again. Silent. She didn't look at it. The man took one step forward and stopped. Then, from somewhere above, from the third level, she thought, though the acoustics in concrete structures were unreliable, there was a sound. Not loud. A shoe scuff. The kind of sound that happened when someone shifted position and caught the sole against the floor. The man's head came up. He turned toward it. He moved, quickly and with purpose, toward the ramp that connected the second level to the third, and she watched him go and did not breathe until he was fully out of her sight line, and then she breathed and looked at her phone. 2 messages. First, stay down. Second, arrived 20 seconds ago. We have him. Other exit. Don't move yet. She stayed. 4 minutes passed that felt substantially longer than 4 minutes. She spent them the way she'd spent difficult time before, not by managing her emotions, which was a fiction, but by keeping her attention on observable facts. The parking structure had 2 exits she could see from her position. The fire alarm in the building had stopped at some point in the last 90 seconds, which meant either it had been managed or it had served its purpose. The lighting on the second level was fluorescent and partial. 2 of the overhead units were out, which created specific shadow distributions that she'd already mapped when she first pressed against the pillar. The stairwell door opened at the 4-minute mark. Not the man. Rice. He came in with 2 other people she recognized from the investigative team, and he moved directly to her position with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she was, which meant the eyes on the structure had been literal. Clear, he said when he reached her. She came off the pillar. Her back ached from pressing against the concrete, which she hadn't noticed until she wasn't pressing anymore. Who was he? We're running him now. He was in the lobby when you came in this morning. We flagged him then but didn't move because we didn't have a reason. When you called about the elevator pair and we activated on them, he reacted, which told us he was watching the building, not just in it. Was he after me specifically? Reese looked at her with the steady directness she'd come to understand was his default setting for information he didn't want to soften. We don't know yet. It's possible. The people running this operation became aware this week that something had shifted inside the hospital. If they identified you as the friction point, he paused. We should have moved you this afternoon. You needed me on the floor. We also needed you not in a parking structure. I'm fine. You're not injured, he said. That's not the same thing. She acknowledged this with a look and moved on. The 2 from the elevator. Detained. The man is a legal associate of the outreach center we were already targeting for tonight's warrant. The woman hasn't identified herself yet. Both are being transported off-site. He looked at her steadily. The case number you saw on the folder, did you get a complete notation? Partial. Enough to confirm it was Caldwell Ridge's internal system. The prefix was different from the 23 we know about. Different how? She told him. His expression shifted in a way that she'd learned meant he was filing information that changed something, though he didn't share what. You need to go home, he said. Not to the floor. Home. Marcus. Sergeant Reed has an overnight nurse in a unit that is currently occupied by federal investigators. He is the safest person in this building right now. She stood with this for a moment. She knew it was right, and she was aware that knowing something was right and accepting it were occasionally different processes. Home, Rice said again, with slightly less patience. She went home. She slept 4 hours. Not well, but functionally. The kind of sleep that was less about rest and more about her body forcing a maintenance shutdown on systems that had been running without interruption since the previous night. She was awake at 4:30 and at the kitchen table with her laptop and her records by 5, adding the parking structure to the timeline, adding the partial case notation, adding every observation she could reconstruct from the evening with the same flat factual language she always used. When she was done, she made coffee and sat with it and thought about Sandra Okafor. She didn't know if the woman had called Pharaoh. She didn't know what her husband's case looked like, or where he was now, or what the second doctor had said when they'd looked at the Caldwell Ridge discharge documentation. She knew only the quality of Sandra Okafor's voice on the phone, that particular texture of someone who has been dismissed so many times they've started to believe they might be wrong, even when they're not. She thought about the 17 that had become 23, that had become a case file with a different prefix riding up an elevator. She thought about what Rice had said. One of them is not. She closed her laptop. She was on the floor at 7:15. The fourth floor of Caldwell Ridge on that Thursday morning was not the same floor it had been at the beginning of the week, and the difference wasn't only in personnel or procedure. It was atmospheric in a way that Larkin had encountered before in institutions where something significant had happened and the walls hadn't fully absorbed it yet. Staff moved with a particular deliberateness. Conversations were shorter and more specific. People who would normally have paused at the nursing station to exchange the ambient, professional small talk that constituted most of a shift's social texture were getting their information and moving on. Deborah was already there. She had the overnight notes in her hand and the expression of someone who had been up longer than was useful and had decided to be present anyway. "Anything overnight?" Larkin asked. Reed slept. 4.5 hours. Atlas ate this morning without issue. Deborah handed her the notes. 2 investigators were on the floor until 2 a.m. They've cleared the clinical documentation access points. They put some kind of monitoring system on the files. Did they tell you that? Farrow told me at 1:15 when I brought her coffee. A slight pause. I was here until 1:15. Larkin looked at her. Deborah. I'm fine. The tone was the same one Larkin had used on Rice last night, which Deborah apparently recognized because something in her face shifted briefly. I couldn't leave. I kept thinking about the files, about which patients, whether there was something in the overnight notes I'd missed. Was there? Nothing clinical. There's a patient in 406 who's been here 3 weeks with a trauma presentation I've been watching it. The medication protocol doesn't fit the presentation, and I flagged it twice with the attending and was told I was outside my clinical scope. Larkin looked at her steadily. Flag it with Farrow. It's just a nursing observation. Deborah, flag it with Farrow. A beat. Okay. She went to her rounds. Marcus was awake when she knocked. He was at the table with the notebook closed, an atlas lying across his feet, and he looked like someone who had spent the night in lighter sleep than his numbers suggested, but had used the time for something. His expression had a quality of settled determination that hadn't been there yesterday. You weren't here last night, he said. Something came up. I was off site. He looked at her. Something happened. It's handled. Are you? I'm fine, she said, and heard the same slight flatness in it that she'd had with Rice, and amended, I wasn't in danger. Something happened in the building after I left, and I was kept away from it until it was managed. That's still not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. She sat in her chair. She was tired in a way that was bone level rather than surface, and she was aware of it in the specific way of someone who knows that acknowledging fatigue and doing anything about it are 2 different processes right now. They're going to come to you today, she said. Farrow's team. They may have additional questions given what developed last night. What developed? She looked at him. 2 people came into the building yesterday evening who may be connected to the referral network. There may be more cases than we initially documented. His jaw did what it did when he was managing something large without showing it. How many more? Unknown. That's what today is about. And the people who came in, detained, he absorbed this. Atlas shifted beneath the table and Marcus's hand moved without thought to the dog's back, the contact automatic and complete. I've been thinking, he said, about the men I know, guys I served with, guys who came home to things that were harder than the deployment. Some of them ended up in systems like this. He stopped. I kept thinking I was having a paranoid episode, that the way this place felt wrong was my diagnosis talking. You told me that yesterday. I'm telling you again because I want you to understand what it costs, to not trust your own read on a room. He looked at her with the directness that had become, over 13 days, one of the constants in this situation. I trusted yours instead. I don't do that easily. She held his gaze. I know. I want that on record somewhere, he said. That I knew something was wrong, and the reason I didn't just walk out of here on day 2 is because you showed up on day 3, and you knew it too, and you stayed. Larkin opened her mouth to say something about clinical responsibility, and said instead, it'll be in my statement. He nodded. She did his vitals, and went back to the floor. Bum. The investigation hit its next visible escalation at 9:40, and this time Larkin was at the nursing station when it happened and watched it unfold in real time. A federal transport vehicle had been in the hospital's rear parking area since 7 a.m. She'd seen it when she arrived and had noted it and filed it with the things she was monitoring without showing she was monitoring them. At 9:40, 3 people came through the main staff entrance to the 4th floor with Farrow and went directly to the room that had been designated as the investigative working space. 20 minutes later, Farrow came to the nursing station. She looked at Larkin with the expression of someone who has information and is deciding how much of it to convey to a witness. "I want to update you on last night," she said, at a level that wasn't quite private. "The male individual from the elevator has been identified. His name is Patrick Vorn. He's the legal director of the Harlow City Veterans Outreach and Coordination Center, the organization we executed the warrant on last night." Larkin kept her expression where it was. "At approximately 11 p.m. last night, we found documentation at the Outreach Center confirming a referral agreement between the center and Caldwell Ridge's administration going back 27 months. The agreement on paper was a standard client referral arrangement, veterans needing inpatient care being routed to available facilities." Farrow paused. The communication underneath that agreement was different. Specifically, a selection protocol that identified veterans with classification indicators in their service records and routed them preferentially to Caldwell Ridge. "Why those veterans specifically?" Larkin said, though she had a shape for the answer already. "Because their service records were difficult to fully verify by outside parties. Because if something went wrong with their treatment and they or their families tried to challenge the documentation, the classification made the challenge harder." Farrow's voice was professionally flat, which was the only way you could say something like this without the weight of it becoming the whole conversation. "Because they were the population least likely to be believed." The nursing station was quiet for a moment. "Who originated the protocol?" Larkin said. "Robert Calloway coordinated it on the hospital's side. On the Outreach Center side, the director, a woman named Morella Voss, designed the selection criteria. She was arrested at 10:15 last night at her residence." Larkin registered the name. "And the purpose? The clinical manipulation. What was the end goal?" "That's still being determined. The working theory is insurance fraud at significant scale. Veterans with complex, ambiguous presentations that generated extended inpatient billing, diagnoses that justified ongoing pharmaceutical protocols, discharge planning that created return admission pathways." Farrow stopped. "But there are elements that don't fit the fraud model cleanly. The targeting of classified service background suggests an additional component we're still mapping. Someone wanted to know what those veterans knew," Larkin said. Farrow looked at her for a moment. "That's a possibility under active investigation." The implications of that settled in Larkin's chest with a specific weight that she chose not to examine fully right now, because examining it fully would pull her attention somewhere she couldn't afford to have it while she was on this floor, in this unit, responsible for the people in these rooms. "The case file from the elevator," she said, "the prefix I described. We found 41 additional files at the Outreach Center matching that prefix. They're a separate routing tier, Shama, a subset of the referral population that was flagged for additional access monitoring inside Caldwell Ridge. We're cross-referencing them now. 41. Not 23. Not 24. 64, at minimum, when you put the numbers together." "Are the 41 all at Caldwell Ridge by—" Larkin said. "No." Farrow's expression was the most specific it had been in the conversation. 15 are at other facilities, 3 other hospitals in 2 other states. The same protocol, implemented at different institutions. Larkin looked at her. "This is not a local operation," Farrow said. "It's the reason we have the resources we have, and why the timeline on this has moved the way it has." She didn't tell Marcus the scope of it. Not yet. What she told him, when she checked in at 11, was that the investigation had expanded, and that the federal response had expanded with it, and that the people responsible for what had been done to him and to the others were currently in federal custody with no prospect of leaving it. He asked her the number. She told him 64 as a floor, not a ceiling. He sat with that for a while without saying anything. Atlas put his head in Marcus's lap, the full weight of it, and Marcus's hand rested on the dog's skull, and he looked at the window. "What happens to the ones who are still in places like this?" he said finally. The investigators are working with state and federal health oversight to flag those cases for immediate independent clinical review. How long does that take? Faster than it would have 3 days ago. She looked at him. The system is moving, Marcus. It's not moving the way you want it to, which is instantly, but it is moving. He looked at her. You're telling me to be patient. I'm telling you that what you agreed to do, testifying, going on record, not being a redacted number, is going to matter to those 64 cases in ways we can't fully see yet. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. No, she said. It's not. But it's what's available right now, and you know the difference between what's available and what's ideal. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. That's the most soldier thing anyone said to me since I got here. I'll take that. The afternoon brought the most visible shift yet, and it came not from inside the hospital, but from outside it. At 2:15, Larkin was updating documentation at the nursing station when Deborah came and stood beside her with a look that had something new in it. Not the weight of contained information, but the specific expression of something that has moved from inside a building to outside it and changed character in the transition. News van, Deborah said quietly. 2 of them, outside the main entrance. Larkin kept typing. How long? Arrived about 20 minutes ago. Security asked them to move back from the entrance and they did, but they're still there. Deborah paused. Someone talked. Someone always talks, Larkin said. Was the hospital administration notified? The PR director is on the 6th floor right now, with Storo. How's Storo doing? Deborah made a sound. He looks like a man who got on a train without checking where it was going. Larkin finished her entry. Is the PR director going to issue a statement? I don't know. Farrow's office requested they hold any external communication until 5 p.m. Then we hold. She went back to her rounds. On her pass, she stopped at the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked out over the east side of the building, and she could see the news vehicles from there. 2 of them, a third pulling in as she watched, and a cluster of people with equipment that meant this had already moved from showing up to setting up. Someone had talked. It might have been a staff member, might have been a federal source, might have been one of the families the investigators had contacted. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that once cameras arrived outside a building, the internal dynamics of that building changed in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes weren't, and the next few hours would determine which this was. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to the secure line. Media at main entrance. 3 vehicles as of 2:22 p.m. PR director on site. Farrow's hold request communicated. Update. Response came back in 4 minutes. Hold is intact. Do not comment to any press. Tell staff the same. She told Deborah. Deborah told the floor. Robert Calloway's attorney arrived at the federal field office across the city at 3 p.m. and made a statement at 3:40 that his client was cooperating fully with investigators and that the situation was more complex than current reporting suggested. The statement was brief and said nothing specific and was the kind of statement that lawyers gave when they were buying time to find out what the other side actually had. What the other side had, as it turned out, was substantial. Larkin found this out not from Rice or Farrow, but from her phone, from a local news alert that came through at 3:52. Someone at the network had sources, and the sources had spoken, and the headline read, Federal investigators execute warrants at Harlow City Veterans Hospital and Outreach Center. Multiple arrests made in alleged veterans medical fraud scheme. She read it at the nursing station. Deborah read it over her shoulder. It's out, Deborah said. It's out, Larkin said. The implications moved through the floor in the specific way that information moved through a contained space when multiple people received it simultaneously through their personal devices and had to keep performing their professional functions while processing it. Larkin watched it happen and stayed at her station and kept her face where it was and answered 2 questions from nurses who asked her what she knew, which she answered with, I know what's in the news alert. Let Farrow's team do their work. At 4:15, Farrow came out of the working room with the expression of someone who had just received a piece of information that had changed the shape of her afternoon. She came to Larkin. Calloway is talking, she said. Larkin looked at her. He's been in interview since 1 p.m. He was cooperative in a technical sense, answering questions, not obstructing. But at 3:30 he asked for a 20-minute break, and when he came back, his attorney indicated he wanted to expand his cooperation substantially in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. He's giving up the network. He's giving up everything. Farrow's voice stayed flat. Voss, the Outreach Center director, has been in a separate interview. They don't know the other is talking. We have 2 independent sources now confirming the same structural picture. And Tran? Larkin said. Farrow paused. The pause was a fraction of a second too long. Dr. Tran's role is more complicated than we initially assessed, she said. She was aware of the preferential referral arrangement. She facilitated the admissions protocol. Whether she understood the extent of what the clinical documentation manipulation was being used for, another pause. Calloway says she didn't know the full picture. Voss says she did. 2 people who both have reasons to lie. Yes, Farrow said. It will be adjudicated. The email she sent, recommending my removal, timed to the day after the federal visitors. We have that document. It's in the evidence package. If she knew investigators were on the floor and immediately moved to remove the person who had been generating friction, it's in the package, Mercer. She stopped pushing. At 5 p.m., the hospital's PR director issued a statement that said Caldwell Ridge was cooperating fully with federal authorities and that patient welfare remained the institution's primary concern. The statement was 4 sentences long and said nothing that could be used as anything. The news cameras outside filmed it being read by a spokesperson who looked like she was managing a significant personal desire to be somewhere else. Larkin watched it on her phone in the break room. Then she went back to the floor and found Priya at the medication cart and stopped. "How are you?" she asked. Priya looked at her. She'd been carrying something since yesterday that was visible in the set of her shoulders and the careful quality of her movements, the hypervigilance of someone who had done a correct thing and was still waiting to find out what it was going to cost them. "Farrow told me this morning that what I gave them mattered," Priya said. "The photo." It did. I keep thinking about the things I saw and didn't connect. The access logs, the file patterns. I've been here 2 years and She stopped. I told myself it wasn't my place. "You were 22 when you started here," Larkin said. "You told yourself what the institution told you, which is that pattern recognition above your grade level was outside your scope. That's not a personal failure." "Feels like one. I know." Larkin looked at her steadily. "The difference between you and most people in your position is that when you finally did connect it, you did something. You took a photo. You came to me." She paused. That mattered. Priya was quiet for a moment. "Is it going to be okay for the patients who were the ones who went through this?" Larkin thought about Sandra Okafor's voice on the phone, about the discharge papers with diagnoses that didn't match presentations, about the one who hadn't made it, which was a phrase that sat in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying around all week. "For some of them, yes," she said. "For some of them, we don't know yet. And for one of them," she stopped. "For one of them, it's already too late. And that's going to be part of the record and part of what gets adjudicated and part of why the people who did this are going to face consequences that are proportional to what they did." Priya absorbed this with the specific expression of someone receiving a hard truth and deciding not to look away from it. "Okay," she said quietly. She went back to the medication cart. Marcus's formal statement to the investigators took 2 hours and 15 minutes and happened in his room, which Farrow had agreed to after Larkin made the case that transporting him to an interview room would be a logistical and clinical disruption that served no investigative purpose. She was not present for the interview. She waited at the nursing station and updated documentation and checked her phone at irregular intervals and drank bad coffee and did not watch the clock. When Farrow came out at 6:45, she stopped at the nursing station. "Sergeant Reed is a precise witness," she said. "I know. He has specific dates, specific language, specific descriptions of interactions that correlate with the documentation modification timeline with a high degree of accuracy." Farrow looked at her. His assessment of what was being done to him, the way he described recognizing the tactical patterns, the environmental control, the information management, that framing is going to be significant in how this is presented to a jury. "He's been reading rooms his whole career," Larkin said. "He read this one correctly from the start." His confidence in that read was being systematically undermined. Yes, Larkin said. That was the mechanism. Farrow looked at her for a moment with the expression she sometimes had, the one that was professional neutrality over something else, something that was doing its own parallel processing. Your clinical instinct going in the other direction, reinforcing his self-assessment, treating his behavioral patterns as rational rather than pathological. That was counterindicated by his diagnosis, his treatment plan, and the institutional consensus around his case. The institutional consensus was wrong. Yes, but that's only obvious now. She paused. I want to ask you something. When you first came into his room on your third day here, and you formed the assessment you formed, were you operating on clinical nursing training or something else? Larkin looked at her steadily. Both, she said, and I'm not sure the distinction is as clean as the question implies. Farrow considered this. Fair, she said, and went back to the working room. At 7:30 p.m., Rice appeared on the floor for the first time since the previous evening. He looked like a man who had been awake for 36 hours and had decided that this was not a material fact requiring acknowledgement. He came to Larkin with the directness she'd come to understand as his default, and said, Tran has formally requested an immunity conference. Larkin looked at him. She wants to provide information about the referral network's additional institutional connections in exchange for a sentencing reduction on her own charges. He paused. The charges she's facing include conspiracy, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. Specifically, the disciplinary actions taken against you, which we've formally characterized as retaliatory obstruction of a federal investigation. She didn't know there was a federal investigation when she filed those actions. She knew something was happening and she acted to silence it. The characterization holds. Larkin sat with this for a moment. The specific satisfaction of institutional accountability was something she'd been careful not to allow herself to want too openly, because wanting it had a way of making people's judgment worse. But she was aware of it now, in the room, as a real presence. What's the additional information she's offering? She said. She's claiming to have documentation of 2 additional facilities in the network that haven't been identified yet. A hospital in another state and a residential treatment center. Rice looked at her evenly. Whether that documentation exists, and whether it's what she says it is, we'll know in the morning. And if it does exist, then this becomes significantly larger than what we've been managing in this building. He paused. And your role as a material witness becomes correspondingly more significant. She looked at him. You're telling me this in advance because you've had one day since this started without something you weren't expecting, and I'd rather you hear this from me at 7:30 than from a news alert at 10. She accepted this. Okay. Go home, Mercer. I need to check on Marcus first. 2 minutes. She went to room 412 and knocked and came in, and Marcus was at the table with the notebook open again, and he looked like someone who had talked for 2 hours and 15 minutes about something difficult and had come out the other side of it in a specific way. Not lighter exactly, but settled. The way a wound felt after it had finally been properly treated. How was it? She asked. Harder than I expected, he said. I thought because I'd been thinking about it since yesterday it would be. I thought I had the language ready. He stopped. Some of it I didn't have language for. She sat in her chair. That's normal? Farrow was good. She didn't push where I ran out of words. She just waited. She's good at her job. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The quality of someone who has been carrying something and is about to choose to set part of it down. I need to say something. She waited. 11 days ago, I had decided I wasn't going to talk to anyone new. The previous nursing staff, the attendings, the administrative people who came through, I had made a decision that I was done extending any part of myself to this institution because every time I had it was used against me. He looked at his hands on the notebook. And then you knocked on the door and you said my rank. You said staff sergeant, not Mr., not patient, not sir. He looked up. I hadn't heard my rank in 8 months. Larkin held very still. I don't know if you knew what that would do, he said. I don't know if it was calculated or instinct or something else, but I need you to know that it was the thing. That was the thing that made me not throw the tray at the door. She sat with that for a moment. Both, she said. He looked at her. You asked if it was calculated or instinct, she said. Both. He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at his notebook. She left 2 minutes later and was at the elevator when her phone buzzed. The secure line. A text that was longer than usual. Trans attorney just provided a preliminary document to our office. The additional facility documentation is real. Third institution identified is a military-affiliated outpatient clinic in another state that processed referrals for active duty personnel with undisclosed mental health issues. We are running the names now. She stared at the screen. Active duty. Not veterans. Active duty personnel. The scope had just changed again, in a direction she hadn't anticipated, and that changed the nature of what this was, and who was behind it, and how far the thread went when you followed it past what you could see from inside a hospital in Harlow City. She got into the elevator. The doors closed. Her phone buzzed one more time. One of the names in the third facility's records matches a case in Callaway's files that was flagged as closed 14 months ago. The patient was listed as deceased. She read it twice. Then, the family filed a death certificate, but the Social Security records show activity on that name 6 weeks ago. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She stood in it without moving. Someone who was supposed to be dead was not dead, and whoever had built this system had known that and had filed the paperwork anyway. She stepped out of the elevator. The lobby was quiet at this hour. A security guard at the desk, a janitor with a cart near the east corridor, the main entrance doors showing the empty sidewalk beyond where the news vehicles had been and were now gone. She stood in the lobby and held her phone and thought about 64 names and a third facility and a death certificate that was wrong. And she thought about what kind of operation filed a false death certificate and what that operation would do when it realized that the hospital it had been running for 2 years was currently full of federal investigators. Then she thought about what Rice had said. The people running this became aware this week that something had shifted. And then she thought about the man in the parking structure who had been watching the building. And then she thought about something she hadn't connected until this moment, standing in this lobby. The two people from the elevator, the man and the woman, who had arrived at the same time and had been taken by different routes to different holding locations. And the woman who had not yet identified herself. And the fact that Rice had reported that detail to her as a minor update and not flagged it as a concern. She called the secure line. It rang 4 times before Rice picked up. "The woman from the elevator," she said. "The one who hasn't identified herself." A pause. "She identified herself 20 minutes ago," Rice said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. "Who is she?" A longer pause. "She's a federal employee," he said, "but not from any office involved in this investigation." Larkin stood in the lobby. "Rice," she said. "She's from a DOD oversight unit with jurisdiction over classified personnel records," he said. "She says she's been running a parallel investigation into the same operation for 7 months. She says she came here tonight because the investigation was about to be compromised." Compromised by who? The pause that followed was the longest one she'd heard from him in 4 days. "By someone inside the federal task force," he said quietly. The lobby was very still. "She has documentation," he said. "We're reviewing it now. Mercer." He stopped. "I need you to go directly home and do not contact anyone on the investigative team until you hear from me personally. Not text, not the secure line. Personal call only." She stood in the lobby with the security guard 20 feet away and the janitor moving slowly down the east corridor, and the weight of what she'd just heard settling into the architecture of everything she thought she understood about the last 4 days. "Who is it?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said only, "Someone who knew where you were going to be tonight." The east corridor was empty now. She turned around. The janitor's cart was against the wall. The janitor was gone. She looked at the place where the janitor had been for exactly 2 seconds, then moved. Not running. Running in a lobby with a security guard present created variables. She walked at the pace of someone who knew where they were going, which she didn't, but the pace itself was information management. Don't announce, don't accelerate, get through the door and into a space with more options. She went through the main entrance. The sidewalk outside was empty where the news vehicles had been. The parking structure was to her left. The street was to her right. She turned right, away from the structure, away from enclosed concrete, into open air and ambient city light, and the specific vulnerability of a woman alone on a sidewalk at 7:50 p.m. who was trying to think clearly about something that had just rearranged the architecture of the past 4 days. She kept walking and put the phone to her ear. "I'm outside," she told Rice. "Main entrance, going east on foot. The janitor in the east corridor disappeared while I was on the phone with you." Description. She gave it. Everything she'd cataloged in the 2 seconds she'd watched him before she moved, which was more than most people would have registered. "Keep moving," Rice said. "East on that street to the corner, then north. There's a 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks north on Calendar. Go inside and stay visible." She walked. "Talk to me about what you meant." "Someone inside the task force." The DoD oversight officer, her name is Agent Laurel Vass, says she's been tracking this operations intelligence component for 7 months. She identified Caldwell Ridge as a node 4 months ago. She didn't surface because she was concerned about compromised personnel in the Joint Task Force. Compromised how? She has documentation suggesting that one person on the task force has been passing operational details to the people running the network. Specifically, information about investigative timelines and witness identities. Larkin crossed a street. The night air was humid, and the city was doing its ordinary evening things around her with total indifference to what she was walking through. "Witness identities," she said. "Yes." "So whoever is in the network knew about me specifically." "Vass says you were identified as a risk 4 days before we moved on the hospital, before we made contact with you in room 412. She stopped at the corner, checked both directions, turned north. "Who on your team is it?" A silence that was 3 seconds long and felt like considerably more. "We're still verifying Vass's documentation," Rice said carefully. "Rice. Mercer. Who?" Another silence. She heard something in the background on his end, voices, movement, the specific ambient sound of a room with multiple people in it managing a controlled urgency. "The JAG officer," he said. "Major Solis." She kept walking. She thought about Major Renata Solis, who had been in room 412 on the first day, who had taken notes, who had been present for Larkin's initial statement, and had asked the specific question about her parallel documentation, and who had, Larkin now understood, been present for the most operationally useful information available in those early hours. She thought about what Solis had access to and what she would have passed and when and to whom, and the timeline assembled itself in the part of her brain that assembled timelines, and the picture it made was one she didn't want to look at directly, but looked at anyway because the alternative was worse. "The man in the parking structure last night," she said. "Almost certainly connected, yes. And the janitor just now is someone who was sent here because Solis told someone where I was going to be." "That's what we believe." She reached the pharmacy and pushed through the door into fluorescent light, and the smell of antiseptic and over-the-counter analgesics, and the completely ordinary sight of 2 people at the register, and a pharmacist in the back, and a security camera in the upper corner of the ceiling that was pointing directly at the entrance. She stood in the personal care aisle where she could see the door. "Where is Solis now?" she said. "In the building. She's been in the working room all afternoon." A pause. "She doesn't know that Vass has identified her. We've been managing the information flow in the room carefully for the past hour." "You've been managing it for an hour and didn't tell me until 20 minutes ago." "We were verifying." "And the janitor was in that building the whole time you were verifying." A pause that was more honest than an answer. "Yes," Rice said. Larkin stood in the personal care aisle and looked at the pharmacy entrance and thought about what it meant that someone had been in that building tonight with access to her location and schedule. And then she stopped thinking about what might have happened because that line of thought served no current operational purpose and moved on. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Stay where you are. I'm sending 2 people to you now. They'll bring you back to a secondary location, not the hospital, where Vass is being interviewed. We'd like you present for that." "Why me specifically?" "Because Vass asked for you," he said, "by name. She says there's something in the documentation she recovered that you need to see." Oh. The 2 people Race sent arrived in 13 minutes in an unmarked vehicle that pulled up to the pharmacy entrance with the quiet purposefulness that distinguished federal transport from everything else on the street. She got in without conversation, and they drove for 22 minutes through Harlow City's evening traffic, and pulled into the underground parking of a building she didn't recognize that turned out to be a federal satellite office. The kind of space that existed in most medium-large cities as a functional outpost for operations that needed to happen away from the primary field office for reasons that didn't get fully explained. Reese was there. Two people she hadn't seen before were there. And across the table, in a chair with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, was a woman of about 45 with the specific contained quality of someone who had been careful for a very long time and had recently decided to stop being careful. Laurel Vass looked at Larkin with the expression of someone who has been watching a situation from the outside and has waited until the right moment to come through the door. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly, with the directness of someone who didn't have the patience for preamble. Larkin sat. Vass pushed a folder across the table. Not a single folder. A stack, 4 inches thick, with dividers and index tabs, and the accumulated look of 7 months of systematic documentation. "I've been running a counterintelligence assessment on a network that uses veteran medical institutions as collection nodes," Vass said. "The clinical abuse, the misdiagnosis, the documentation manipulation, the billing fraud is real, and it's serious, but it's the surface layer. The layer underneath it is intelligence harvesting." Larkin looked at her. The veterans being selectively routed to these facilities were chosen specifically because their service records contained operational information that certain parties wanted access to. The extended inpatient stays, the medication protocols, the structured psychiatric interviews, they were also structured data extraction. What those veterans told their care teams, under treatment conditions in which they reasonably believed they were speaking confidentially, was being collected and aggregated and passed to a third party that is not domestic and is not aligned with U.S. interests. The room was very quiet. The clinical records weren't just being manipulated to justify billing, Larkin said. No, they were being sanitized. The operational content was extracted before the notes went into the official record. What went into the system was the modified diagnostic version. What went somewhere else was a parallel record of everything operationally significant that had been said. Larkin thought about Marcus Reed, about 6 tours and a service record that was partially classified, about the specific quality of the psychiatric interviews she'd seen documented, the language of them, the particular directions in which the questioning had been steered. "How long has this been running?" she said. "We believe the network began establishing institutional connections approximately 3 years ago. Caldwell Ridge was the 3rd facility recruited. The Outreach Center, the Voss Women's Organization, was the recruitment mechanism." "What's the foreign interest?" "That's classified above what I can share in this room right now." Vass looked at her steadily. "What I can tell you is that the investigation I've been running is substantially larger than what Colonel Rice's task force was working, and that the reason I came into that building tonight rather than waiting for a coordinated handoff is that Major Solis communicated to a network contact at approximately 3 p.m. today that the investigation had accelerated beyond the original timeline and that witness material was being gathered. That communication prompted the contact to activate people on the ground here. The man in the parking structure. "And the janitor?" "Yes." Larkin looked at the folder in front of her, which she hadn't opened yet. "You said there was something I specifically needed to see." Vass reached over and opened the folder to a section marked with a red tab. The first page was a compiled profile. She had seen profiles like this before, aggregated from surveillance, from communication intercepts, from financial records, and the structure of it was familiar even before she processed the content. The name at the top was Morella Voss, but the photograph beside it was not the photograph of the Outreach Center director she'd been imagining since Farrow had mentioned the name. The woman in the photograph was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, brown hair, unremarkable appearance, the kind of face that settled into the background of most rooms. The second page was a communication log. The third page was a list of names under a heading that read, Network Personnel, Domestic Operational Layer. Partway down the list, with a date notation beside it indicating when they'd been recruited, was a name Larkin recognized immediately. Not Calloway, not Tran, not Solis. A name from before Caldwell Ridge, a name from a context that had nothing to do with this hospital or this city. She read it twice and then she looked up at Vass. "This person," she said carefully. The date next to their name. Is this when they were recruited into the network or when they were first identified? Recruited, Vass said. The date was 4.5 years ago. The name was the name of the administrator who had processed Larkin's own medical discharge from the armies. What she felt in that moment was not fear. Fear was the wrong word for it, and she'd always been precise about words. What she felt was the specific sensation of a shape becoming visible that had always been present but had previously been in the dark. Not new information arriving, but existing information resolving into a pattern, and the pattern being one she wished she were wrong about and knew she wasn't. My discharge, she said, was processed through channels that the network had access to, Vass said. Yes, and my reassignment to Caldwell Ridge, the staffing reshuffle was not random. The network was aware that Marcus Reed's file had generated anomalies, his behavioral resistance, his failure to complete the extraction protocol in the normal timeline. They identified that a nursing staff change was coming and used their access to the administrative channels to influence which nurse was assigned. Vass looked at her steadily. They thought they were assigning someone who would comply with the treatment direction, or at minimum, not generate the kind of friction you generated. They saw my military background and thought it would make me more compliant with authority. Or they thought your injury-related discharge would make you cautious about risking your civilian career. Vass paused. They misjudged you on both counts. Larkin sat with the full shape of it for a moment. She had not arrived at Caldwell Ridge by accident. She had been placed there by people who thought they were placing a manageable variable, and she had been the wrong variable. And the cascade that followed had been neither planned nor predictable, and had happened anyway because she had walked into a room and read it correctly and done her job. The specific absurdity of that settled in her chest alongside the weight of everything else. The man who processed my discharge, she said. Where is he now? Arrested at 6:45 this evening at his home address in another state. He was the third arrest tonight, coordinated with the Voss arrest. She nodded. Mercer. Voss's voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but with less distance in it. I need to ask you something that is not operationally necessary, but that I'm going to ask anyway. When you walked into that room 11 days ago and started doing what you did, building parallel records, flagging clinical inconsistencies, protecting that patient against institutional pressure, did any part of you suspect that you'd been placed there? Larkin looked at her. No, she said. I thought it was a staffing error. And when Rice made contact. I thought the investigation was about the clinical misconduct. It is. It's also about what's underneath it. I understand that now. Vass looked at her for a long moment. The work you did in that unit, the documentation, the patient advocacy, the specific way you managed 13 days of institutional pressure without breaking or bending, that was not what the network expected from the variable they placed there. And it is the direct reason we were able to move as fast as we did. She paused. I want that said plainly, not operationally, as a matter of record. Larkin held the words. She didn't deflect them. She'd learned that deflecting acknowledgement when it was genuine and earned was its own kind of dishonesty. Thank you, she said. Major Renata Solis was arrested at 10:18 p.m. in the working room at Caldwell Ridge, which was where she'd been all evening, managing information she thought was flowing in one direction while it had been flowing in both directions for the past 3 hours. Larkin wasn't there for the arrest. She was in the federal satellite office finishing a second recorded statement, this one covering the full context of her military discharge, the staffing assignment, and everything she'd observed during her time at Caldwell Ridge that was now recontextualized by what Vass had shared. The statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Jeez. When it was done, Farrow, who had come to the satellite office once Solis was in custody, sat across from her with the look of someone at the end of a very long several days who was running on professionalism and coffee. Solis passed 3 communications to her contact, Farrow said. The first was after the initial meeting in Reed's room. She gave them your name and your parallel documentation activity. The second was after your HR meeting. She gave them the timeline of the suspension and the formal investigation status. The third was this afternoon when she told them the investigation had expanded and that witnesses were being assembled. Ishti itshets. She paused. The janitor tonight was meant to follow you, not harm you. They wanted to know where you were going. They already knew the investigation had them, Larkin said. They were trying to assess how much. Yes, they got their answer when we moved on the outreach center. What's the full count? Facilities, personnel, arrests. Farrow looked at her notepad. 3 facilities. 11 network personnel arrested across tonight and yesterday. 2 additional persons of interest identified in the intelligence component who are outside U.S. jurisdiction and are being handled through diplomatic channels. She set the notepad down. The veteran count, the people who went through the extraction protocol, is currently 78. That includes the 41 from the Outreach Center files, the 23 from Caldwell Ridge's documented cases, and 15 from the 3rd facility. 78. Larkin looked at the table. And the one who was listed as deceased, but wasn't, she said. His name is Calvin Brewer. He's 41. He was a Special Forces intelligence officer. His family was told he died in a care facility in another state 14 months ago. Farrow's voice was entirely controlled, which was the only way she could be delivering this information. He's been located. He's alive. He's been held in a private residential facility under an assumed identity for over a year. She paused. He's in contact with his family as of 9 p.m. tonight. Larkin closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. I want that in my statement, she said. I want it on record that I was told about him and that it was the reason I stayed. It's in the statement, Farrow said. All of it. Well, she didn't go back to Caldwell Ridge that night. Rice called her at midnight and told her to go home and sleep, that tomorrow would begin the formal process and her presence would be needed and useful and she would be no use to anyone running on empty. She went home. She slept 6 hours. Real sleep, continuous. The specific quality of a body that has been holding a significant tension and has been told by its own nervous system that the holding is done. She woke at 7 and lay in the quiet for a few minutes and let herself feel the specific strangeness of a morning that was different from the mornings that had preceded it. Then she got up and got dressed and went back in. The next 2 weeks were the most procedurally intensive of her professional life, and she had worked in a combat medical unit, which was saying something. She gave 3 more recorded statements. She testified before a federal grand jury in a proceeding that lasted 4 hours over 2 sessions, and that required a kind of sustained verbal precision that left her genuinely exhausted in a way that was different from physical fatigue, the specific depletion of someone who has chosen every word carefully for 4 hours straight, because the words are going to matter to 78 people and their families. She sat through press briefings where the U.S. Attorney's Office issued statements that described the network in terms that were accurate but necessarily incomplete given the ongoing intelligence components. She watched on a small screen in a break room as Robert Calloway appeared before a federal magistrate with his attorney and entered a guilty plea to conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and 8 additional counts that his attorney had clearly spent the night preparing him to accept without visible reaction. He accepted them without visible reaction. She watched Morella Voss appear 2 days later and not enter a plea. Not yet, her attorney said. She needed more time. And the footage of Voss in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by counsel, had the specific quality of someone who understood for the first time that the system she'd been operating inside of had a weight to it that she hadn't fully calculated. Major Renata Solis was processed through military justice channels and was not part of the public criminal proceedings, which was how certain things worked, and which Larkin did not comment on when asked by the reporter who called her personal phone at a number she didn't know how the reporter had gotten. She didn't comment on any of it to press. Rice had asked her not to, and she'd agreed, though the number of people who called and emailed and left notes at the Caldwell Ridge nursing station requesting comment told her something about the size of what had become visible. What she focused on during those 2 weeks was the floor. The 4th floor of Caldwell Ridge was in a period of transition that was genuine and disorganized and would have been described charitably as complicated. 3 of the attending physicians had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's review of their clinical decision-making. The psychiatric unit director position was vacant. The hospital's board had convened an emergency governance committee and was in the process of determining, with federal guidance, what an appropriate institutional response looked like. Larkin was not on this governance committee. She was a floor nurse. She did her job. She did her medication rounds and her vitals checks, and her documentation and her handoff briefings, and she answered the questions that staff brought to her, which were many and various and often unanswerable. And she was honest about the ones she couldn't answer, which turned out to be what people most needed rather than false certainty. Deborah ran the floor with the controlled competence of someone who had known something was wrong for a long time and was now living in the specific complicated relief of having been proven right while also having to manage the consequences. "I keep going back to the patients I saw discharged," Deborah said to her one morning at the nursing station between rounds. Whether if I'd pushed harder. "We've had this conversation," Larkin said. "I know." "The answer is the same." "I know." Deborah was quiet for a moment. "I filed my own statement. Everything I told you, I gave to Pharaoh in writing." "I know. She told me." "Does it matter? Will it actually be used?" "It's already in the record. It fills gaps in the timeline that the clinical documentation didn't cover because the clinical documentation was compromised." Larkin looked at her. "It matters." Deborah nodded slowly, the specific exhausted relief of someone doing the right thing and not knowing yet whether it would be enough. Marcus Reed left Caldwell Ridge on a Thursday morning, 18 days after the arrests. He was not discharged into a void. The JAG team had coordinated with a veteran care specialist who had reviewed his complete service history, the unredacted version, which turned out to be significantly different from what his treatment team at Caldwell Ridge had been working from, and had developed an actual treatment plan based on an actual clinical picture, which included a trauma specialist, an ongoing working arrangement with Atlas, and a residential component that allowed him to control his environment in ways that the hospital setting hadn't. Larkin was on the floor when the discharge paperwork was finalized. She heard about it from Deborah and went to room 412 for the last time. He was packed. Not that there had been much to pack. The notebook was in his jacket pocket. Atlas was in working harness, calm and alert and positioned correctly. Marcus himself had the look of a man who was ready, which was different from the look he'd had on any of the 13 days that preceded the investigation, and different again from the way he'd looked during the investigation itself. He looked like himself, she thought, though she was aware she didn't have a reference point for that, having only known him in the one context. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Better than when I came in," he said, which is apparently the clinical threshold. It's a reasonable one. He looked at her for a moment with the directness that had been his constant. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." She waited. "When you came in that first morning, when you sat in that chair and didn't say anything unnecessary, was that training, or is that just who you are?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know how to separate those things anymore," she said. "I'm not sure they were ever separate." He nodded like he'd expected something like that. "You should know. I'm going to say your name in the testimony. In the federal hearing, specifically. I know the legal record probably already has you in it, but I want it said out loud in a proceeding by me that what happened in this room happened because one person showed up and paid attention and didn't leave when they told her to." Her throat did something she managed. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked at her with the same level clarity. "That's why I'm going to." She stood in the doorway while he walked out. Him and Atlas moving with the specific quality of two beings who had their own gravity together, who occupied space in a way that was integrated and real. She watched him go down the corridor and through the unit door, and she did not call after him because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already said. She stood in the empty room for a moment. The window was cracked. She'd left it that way. She closed it and went back to work. The federal hearing was 6 weeks later, and Larkin sat in a wooden chair in a room that smelled like old building and institutional carpet and listened to 78 cases be described in aggregate and then in specific detail by a federal prosecutor who was very good at the particular skill of making statistics into people. She heard Marcus Reed's testimony from a different room through an audio feed because she was also testifying that day, and witnesses were sequestered. His voice came through clearly, and it was measured and specific and occasionally rough around the edges in places that sounded like the truth rather than preparation. And he said her name twice in context that the prosecutor didn't have to prompt, and that the court reporter captured with the same neutral accuracy applied to everything else. She testified for 90 minutes. The judge asked her 2 questions directly, which was unusual and which the prosecutor noted afterward was a sign of the judge's assessment of her credibility as a witness. The first question was, in your professional judgment as a nurse with clinical training and additional background you've described, how would you characterize what occurred at Caldwell Ridge? She said, the institution was used as a mechanism to take people who had already given significant things in service to this country and to take more from them while they were vulnerable, and to make them doubt the accuracy of their own minds in the process. The clinical harm was real. The intelligence harm was real. The harm to the individual's ability to trust the systems that were supposed to protect them was real, and it will outlast the other two. The second question was, what do you believe could have prevented it? She thought for a moment. Someone paying attention, she said. That's not a policy prescription. It's an observation. The mechanism that stopped this was not a protocol or a system. It was a person in a room who noticed something was wrong and wrote it down. The judge made a note. Larkin was released from sequester at 2:15 p.m. The sentencing hearings were spread over 3 weeks, and the outcomes were as follows, which she tracked not because she needed to, but because she believed in keeping accurate records of how things ended. Robert Calloway, 19 years, fraud and conspiracy and obstruction, with the additional intelligence-related charges adding weight that his cooperation agreement had only partially mitigated. He was 53 years old. He would be 72 at the earliest release date, assuming he lived that long. Mirella Voss, 24 years. She had not cooperated, and her attorney's strategy had failed to account for the volume of documentary evidence the investigators had recovered from her own organization. The judge said during sentencing that the exploitation of vulnerable veteran patients for foreign intelligence purposes represented one of the most serious betrayals of institutional trust the court had encountered, and that the sentencing range reflected that assessment. Voss sat through the statement without visible reaction, which the journalist covering the hearing described as chilling in a piece Larkin read once and did not read again. Dr. Sylvia Tran. The adjudication of her case had been the most complicated, given the competing accounts from Calloway and Voss about her knowledge and involvement. What the evidence ultimately supported was knowing participation in the preferential admissions routing and the retaliatory actions against Larkin, with substantial uncertainty about her awareness of the intelligence component. She received 8 years with the possibility of early release contingent on continued cooperation. Larkin did not think this was enough. She did not say so publicly. She filed her personal assessment in her own records and left it there. Patrick Vorn, the legal director who had been in the elevator 6 years, he had known the mechanism without knowing the full intelligence purpose, a distinction the court accepted in part. Renata Solis was handled through the military justice system, and the outcome was not part of the public record, which was how it went, and which Larkin made her peace with because making peace with imperfect outcomes was the other skill you developed when you'd been doing hard things for long enough. The letter from the hospital arrived on a Tuesday, 8 weeks after the hearings concluded. It was on Caldwell Ridge letterhead under the signature of the interim director, who had been appointed by the new governance board that had itself been constituted under federal oversight. The letter formally rescinded the disciplinary actions filed against her. It formally acknowledged that the actions had been retaliatory and improper. It formally apologized. She read it at her kitchen table with coffee she actually tasted this time, and she thought about what a formal apology was worth and what it wasn't worth, and arrived at the conclusion that it was worth less than it should be and more than nothing, which was the honest answer. She kept the letter in her personal records. She kept working. In the months that followed, 3 things happened that she would have described, if pressed, as the actual resolution, not the legal outcomes, which were their own category, but the things that meant something in the register she actually cared about. The first was Sandra Okafor's husband. His name was James Okafor, and he was 46, and he had been at Caldwell Ridge for 12 days before his discharge, and the diagnosis he'd been given there had led to a medication protocol that his second doctor had described as actively contraindicated for his actual presentation. Sandra had been trying to get someone to take this seriously for 3 months when she'd called Larkin's personal phone. After the investigation, James Okafor's case was one of the first reviewed under the Federal Independent Clinical Assessment Program that had been established in the wake of the hearings. He received a corrected diagnosis, a revised treatment plan, and a formal acknowledgement from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs that the care he'd received at Caldwell Ridge had been negligent and deliberately compromised. He was not fully recovered. He was better. He was getting the treatment he'd actually needed. Sandra Okafor sent Larkin a handwritten note, which Larkin read and then kept in a drawer rather than a file, because some things belonged in a drawer. The second was Calvin Brewer. She didn't meet him, she didn't seek out contact, and he didn't initiate it. But a federal investigator told her, in the context of a follow-up conversation about the intelligence component, that Calvin Brewer had been reunited with his family, was in appropriate care, and had given a statement to congressional investigators that was classified but that had been described by the committee chair as among the most significant testimony received in the inquiry. She sat with that for a while. A man who had been filed as dead for 14 months, who had been held somewhere she still didn't fully know the details of, who was now alive and with his family and giving testimony that mattered. She couldn't claim any part of finding him, only the part where the investigation that found him had started moving because she'd noticed something wrong in a room and written it down. That was enough. It didn't need to be more than that. The third thing was the program. 3 months after the sentencing hearings, Larkin received a call from a woman named Dr. Adaez Oko, who was the director of Veteran Care Policy for the Department of Veterans Affairs and who had been one of the people quietly watching the Caldwell Ridge investigation from the policy side since its early stages. Dr. Oko was building a working group to develop federal standards for veteran psychiatric care that specifically addressed the vulnerabilities the Caldwell Ridge case had exposed, the ways that institutional processes had been gamed, the clinical warning signs that had been present but unread, the advocacy and documentation practices that had made the difference. She wanted Larkin involved, not in an honorary capacity, not as a face or a story, as a working practitioner whose specific expertise, clinical nursing, parallel documentation methodology, the particular skill of reading a room when the room was actively trying to mislead you, was materially relevant to what needed to be built. Larkin said she needed a week to think about it. She thought about it for 3 days and called back and said yes. She still worked the floor. This was something people found surprising, the colleagues who knew the full story, the investigators who had watched her operate through 4 days of escalating pressure, the journalist who called a second time and whom she again declined to speak with. The assumption seemed to be that what had happened meant she was done with direct patient care, that she'd moved up or out or into something that looked less like a nurse doing rounds at 7 a.m. She hadn't. She was on the floor at Caldwell Ridge, reconstituted Caldwell Ridge, under new leadership, with a federal oversight component that would run for 3 years, with a veteran care coordination team that actually read the full service records, 3 days a week, and spent the other 2 days a week on the policy working group. She liked the combination. The policy work needed the floor, and the floor kept the policy honest. One morning, about 4 months after the sentencing, she was doing rounds on the 4th floor unit, a different 4th floor in some ways, the same one in others, when Deborah appeared beside her with the expression of someone delivering information they weren't sure how to frame. New admit, room 409, former Marine 2 Tours service dog, presenting as resistant to treatment and uncooperative with staff. Larkin kept walking. What's the dog's name? Deborah looked at her. Kira. Has anyone talked to the dog? Larkin. Has anyone introduced themselves to the dog and waited for the dog to assess them before approaching the patient? A pause. Probably not. That's where we start. She stopped outside room 409. She checked the chart. She stood outside the door for a moment the way she always did. The 30 seconds of listening and settling and being present before committing to the threshold. Then she knocked twice, said her name and her role, said she was going to open the door slowly, and opened it. The Marine was against the far wall. The dog was in front of him. Both of them were tracking her from the moment she came in. She stopped at the threshold. Permission to enter, she said. The dog's ears moved. She stayed in the doorway and waited. There is a version of this story that is about institutional failure and legal accountability and the specific machinery of federal investigation. That version is real and important and is documented in court records that are publicly accessible to anyone who wants to read them. But that version isn't really the story. The story is about what happens in a room when one person decides to pay attention. Not heroic attention, not the kind that arrives in a single dramatic moment and resolves everything in a montage. The ordinary, sustained, unglamorous kind. The attention that shows up at 7 a.m. and asks practical questions and writes down the answers and comes back at the same time the next day and the day after that and doesn't stop when the institution makes coming back complicated. Larkin Mercer was not a perfect person and had not been a perfect nurse. She had blind spots and wrong calls behind her, and probably more ahead. She had been placed in a situation by people who thought they knew what she would do, and she had done something else, not because she was exceptional, but because she had learned a long time ago in conditions she didn't talk about, that the most important thing you could do in any room was to actually see what was in it. Marcus Reed had been in a room where nobody was seeing him, and then somebody was. That's the whole story, really. Everything else followed. The woman the hospital had once called too soft, too inexperienced, completely wrong for the unit, stood in the doorway of room 409 on a Tuesday morning and waited for a dog named Kira to decide she was safe. And when the dog's ears settled and its posture changed, and the Marine against the wall exhaled, just slightly, just barely enough to notice if you were the kind of person who noticed, she stepped inside. She didn't announce what she knew or what she'd done. She pulled a chair to a careful distance, sat down, and opened her kit. "I'm going to check your vitals," she said, "and then I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Everything else can wait." The Marine looked at her. He didn't speak, but he didn't reach for the tray. Outside the window, Harlow City was doing what cities do, ordinary and indifferent, and entirely unaware that in a room on the 4th floor of a hospital that had nearly destroyed something important and had been stopped by someone who refused to look away, a new version of the same work was beginning. The same work it had always been. The work of being in the room and seeing what was there. That work doesn't end. It just keeps finding the next room.